Bonjour, je me présente, Bernard Millet, je suis le président de l'Association française pour les Nations Unies et j'ai plaisir de vous accueillir et d'ouvrir cette conférence qui prélude une longue journée qui sera, j'en suis sûr, fort intéressante. Donc, elle se passe aussi bien en présence, mais la résurgence un peu de la Covid fait que les rangs risquent d'être un peu plus clairsemés aujourd'hui en présence physique, mais je suis certain que nous serons nombreux à pouvoir suivre virtuellement, puisque maintenant nous avons l'habitude des visioconférences, à beaucoup de personnes de voir et puis ultérieurement de revoir toute cette conférence, puisque ces actes seront présents sur notre chaîne YouTube ou sur le site internet de l'Association française pour les Nations Unies. Je regrette parce que la Covid fait son effet, difficulté aussi. Nous n'aurons pas le plaisir d'avoir physiquement Madame Bérangère Hadin, la secrétaire d'État à la Biodiversité, qui devait être présente ce matin à l'ouverture, mais qui, malgré tout, a tenu à nous parler, et ce sera à l'occasion d'une vidéo qui sera présentée tout de suite ce matin après mon intervention, et celle que je remercie beaucoup de son Altesse Sérénissime le Prince Albert de Monaco, dont chacun sait combien il est engagé sur toutes les causes concernant l'environnement et depuis longtemps. À titre personnel, j'avais d'ailleurs déjeuné côte à côte avec lui lors du déjeuner officiel que Kofi Annan, alors secrétaire général des Nations Unies, avait organisé au moment du sommet du millénaire, donc en octobre 2000 ou septembre 2000. C'était un moment fondateur pour tout ce qui est intervenu ensuite en matière de développement durable, puisque les premiers objectifs du développement durable ont été fixés à cette occasion. Donc son engagement, et j'avais pu le vérifier lors de ce déjeuner, était très fort dès ce moment-là. Je tiens aussi à remercier, au-delà de Madame Abba, Madame Pompili et le ministère de la Transition écologique qui a bien voulu nous apporter son soutien financier pour cette opération, et c'est la marque de l'importance et de l'intérêt qui porte à nos travaux, que ce ministère porte à nos travaux, et je m'en félicite. Je tiens aussi, elle interviendra un petit peu plus tard dans la journée, à remercier Madame Sherine Zorba, qui dirige le Science Policy and Business Forum du programme des Nations Unies pour l'environnement, avec qui nous avons noué un accord de partenariat dont nous nous félicitons, qui nous permet d'envisager sur toutes ces questions à l'avenir des coopérations qui, j'en suis sûr, seront fructueuses. Et ce partenariat, d'ailleurs, est suivi très attentivement, tout comme cette conférence n'aurait pas pu avoir lieu, ne serait pas tenu sans le rôle majeur qui a été joué par Jean-Pierre Tardieu, que vous entendrez tout à l'heure, qui est membre du bureau de l'AFNU, et Jérémy Mercier, qui toujours est la cheville ouvrière de nos travaux. Et je remercie aussi Pierre-Henri Guignard, qui nous a reçus et qui nous a rejoints au COMEX, et qui aussi sur ces questions en connaît un rayon pour avoir été l'un des organisateurs de l'accord de Paris et de la conférence de Paris, qui a été un moment très fort en matière d'environnement. La raison d'être de l'AFNU, naturellement, est de promouvoir les valeurs, les principes, mais aussi les buts et les objectifs de la Charte des Nations Unies. Et ces buts et objectifs, ils sont de trois ordres. C'est naturellement ce qu'on voit le plus fréquemment, la paix et la sécurité internationale, la promotion des droits de l'homme, qui n'est pas toujours simple, et on le voit encore ces jours-ci dans les relations internationales, et naturellement tout ce qui a été le développement, la justice économique et sociale, et aujourd'hui de manière plus forte et concentrée les enjeux globaux, et dans ces enjeux globaux, la défense de l'environnement, le changement climatique, les objectifs du développement durable sont au cœur de l'action, des réflexions des Nations Unies, et l'AFNU se doit d'en être porteur. Il est évident, on le voit de plus en plus, c'est d'ailleurs l'objet d'une discussion qui va avoir lieu dès demain au Conseil de sécurité des Nations Unies, où l'Irlande et le Niger, le président Bazoum présidera d'ailleurs en personne la réunion du Conseil de sécurité, présentent une résolution, un projet de résolution sur la sécurité climatique. On voit combien aujourd'hui, dans toutes les activités des Nations Unies, le problème du climat, le problème de l'environnement, celui de la désertification sont intimement liés avec les autres activités, les autres buts et objectifs ou valeurs que sont la défense des droits de l'homme et la préservation de la paix et de la sécurité internationale. La notion, le concept de sécurité humaine qui aujourd'hui devient de plus en plus important au sein du système des Nations Unies, tend à intégrer toutes ces dimensions, et la dimension environnementale, dont les 3 conventions cadres sont essentielles, que ce soit le changement climatique, la désertification ou la biodiversité, sont au cœur de ces problématiques. On ne peut plus aujourd'hui concevoir, je veux dire, qu'une planète qui soit en paix, en sécurité et un avenir pour les prochaines générations sans que ces 3 éléments soient intégrés. Donc la réunion, la conférence, la journée qu'on a aujourd'hui est un élément essentiel et elle arrive à point nommé. Elle intervient quelques mois après le sommet de l'UICN en septembre à Marseille, qui s'est préoccupé de ces questions, et la biodiversité était au cœur des préoccupations. Elle intervient quelques semaines après la COP 26 à Glasgow, où l'accent a été mis sur la déforestation, donc qui est un élément important, et elle intervient à quelques mois de la COP 15, donc sur la Convention sur la biodiversité qui se tiendra en Chine au mois d'avril, mai prochain. Donc je pense que c'est une occasion à la fois de faire un bilan et de faire valoir ce qui serait essentiel de traiter à cette occasion. Alors l'AFNU est à la fois une association qui s'efforce de promouvoir les activités, les valeurs, les buts, les principes de la Charte des Nations Unies, mais c'est une association de type classique, comme il y en a d'ailleurs dans la plupart des pays du monde, sous l'égide d'une fédération mondiale des associations nationales pour les Nations Unies. C'est une partie de la société civile. Nous n'avons pas de lien organique, ni hiérarchique, ni d'aucun ordre avec le gouvernement français ou avec le ministère, même si nous avons des liens qui sont confiants, permanents, étroits et un soutien, mais nous sommes totalement libres et nous estimons que nous faisons partie de la société civile et que nous pouvons intervenir sur ces questions. Or, la société civile, notamment en matière de droits de l'homme depuis l'origine, mais sur toutes les questions d'environnement depuis la conférence de Rio, de même que les scientifiques au départ et de plus en plus aujourd'hui les entreprises et les collectivités territoriales interviennent dans ce processus, et il est tout à fait logique qu'une association comme la nôtre, de par son rôle, de sa légitimité, doit pouvoir intervenir et faire valoir sa position, sa voix sur ces questions. Donc c'est pour nous une bonne occasion. Comme je le dis, nous aurons l'occasion dans les semaines et mois qui viennent, sur toutes les questions qui touchent au multilatéralisme et à la vie des Nations Unies et à ses activités, de produire un certain nombre de documents et un livre bleu qui devrait, au sens large, sur toutes les questions qui sont traitées dans le système des Nations Unies, nous permettre d'avancer. Donc je suis heureux d'ouvrir cette séance qui commencera par le message Son Altesse le Prince Albert de Monaco, qui, vous le verrez, est toujours aussi engagé sur ces thèmes, et il sera suivi du message de Madame Bérangère Abba, secrétaire d'État à la diversité, avant que les tables rondes ne soient introduites. Je laisserai le soin à Jean-Pierre Tardieu ensuite de présenter les tables rondes. En tout cas, merci et très bonne journée à tous.
Mesdames et messieurs, chers amis, c'est un plaisir de pouvoir prendre aujourd'hui la parole devant vous, fût-ce par écran interposé. L'important est bien que l'on puisse aujourd'hui parler de la biodiversité, un enjeu vital pour nous tous, malheureusement encore trop souvent négligé. Si nos sociétés ont peu à peu compris l'importance des enjeux climatiques, les conséquences du réchauffement et la responsabilité de nos modes de vie dans les dérèglements du climat, il n'en va hélas pas toujours de même pour ce qui concerne la biodiversité. Chacun constate bien sûr que telle ou telle espèce naguère abondante a tendance à disparaître de nos villes, de nos champs ou de nos mers. Chacun conçoit bien les risques que représenterait l'extinction de certaines espèces, surtout lorsqu'il s'agit d'espèces à l'aspect sympathique, comme certains gros mammifères, ou à l'utilité directe, comme les pollinisateurs. Et nous nous habituons à entendre parler d'une 6e vague d'extinction des espèces. Pour autant, il me semble que tout cela reste souvent lointain, abstrait et surtout difficile à transformer en action. Pour sauver le climat, nous savons désormais à peu près que la transition énergétique s'impose. Il ne s'agit pas bien sûr de la seule mesure à mettre en œuvre, mais c'est la principale. Pour sauver la biodiversité, en revanche, les solutions sont moins univoques et surtout moins simples. Face à cette complexité, le sentiment d'impuissance peut donc dominer. C'est pourquoi il est particulièrement important d'attirer l'attention de nos contemporains sur le drame qui se joue et qui va bien au-delà de quelques espèces de gros mammifères sympathiques ou d'espèces directement utiles. Je vous rappelle que l'IPBES évaluait récemment à près d'1 million le nombre d'espèces menacées, certaines même pas encore connues. Et c'est pourquoi, surtout, il est essentiel de mettre l'accent sur les solutions qui existent. Car ces solutions existent. Elles font d'ores et déjà la preuve de leur efficacité partout à travers le monde. Elles sont souvent plus accessibles que la transition énergétique, qui exige, elle, un changement très profond dans notre modèle de développement économique, seule manière de sauver le climat. Le changement qu'il nous faut opérer pour sauver la biodiversité, plus que la sortie des hydrocarbures, passe par une multitude de mesures qui chacune est porteuse de progrès concrets, rapides et tangibles. Je n'en ferai pas la liste complète ici, mais je voudrais indiquer quelques pistes que nous devons soutenir. Il y a par exemple la nécessité de lutter contre les pollutions, en particulier plastiques, aux effets dévastateurs sur de nombreuses espèces marines et qui contaminent aujourd'hui l'ensemble de la chaîne alimentaire et affectent notre santé. Il y a l'urgence de se mobiliser sans faiblesse et en résistant aux pressions des lobbies contre les néonicotinoïdes et tous les produits chimiques qui nuisent au développement, à la reproduction et à la survie de nombreuses espèces, notamment pollinisatrices. Il y a l'importance de l'établissement de zones de protection sur terre mais aussi sur mer. Il y a l'importance des aires marines protégées, dont l'efficacité aujourd'hui ne fait plus débat, et qui permettent tout à la fois de protéger les écosystèmes menacés, de régénérer les stocks de poissons et de favoriser pour les populations côtières un développement plus durable. Ces aires marines protégées contribuent en outre à la lutte contre le changement climatique par le développement de puits de carbone et l'atténuation de ses effets par les renforcements de protection naturelle contre les phénomènes extrêmes. C'est une parmi d'autres de ces solutions basées sur la nature dont l'efficacité et l'utilité s'imposent de plus en plus. De telles mesures de préservation doivent être étendues car elles sont encore bien loin de couvrir des surfaces suffisantes, les 10% décidés à Aichi en 2010 n'étant même pas atteints, quand il faudrait viser en réalité 30%. Et d'autres mesures localisées doivent être aussi développées, par exemple autour des récifs coralliens, dont nous connaissons tous l'importance pour la biodiversité. Enfin, parmi les pistes d'action disponibles, comment ne pas citer les mesures ciblées de sauvegarde et de réintroduction d'espèces menacées, comme celle que nous avons par exemple menée autour du thon rouge, une espèce emblématique de Méditerranée qui était menacée d'extinction et qui a désormais retrouvé toute sa place. Nous y sommes parvenus en mobilisant les instances internationales, mais aussi les sociétés civiles et surtout les acteurs économiques qui doivent comprendre à quel point leur intérêt est d'assurer l'avenir des espèces et des écosystèmes dont ils dépendent. Je pourrais également vous parler de la réintroduction du gypaète barbu dans l'arc alpin, qui est un beau succès puisque les populations se reproduisent désormais naturellement, et vous dire notre espoir pour le phoque moine de Méditerranée sur lequel nous portons aujourd'hui nos efforts. C'est pourquoi une initiative comme la vôtre est importante pour moi, tant elle permet de mobiliser les différentes parties prenantes, de leur rappeler leurs responsabilités et leur intérêt et de leur dire surtout que des solutions existent. Des solutions qu'il nous faut aujourd'hui mettre en œuvre sans attendre. Je vous remercie donc pour votre précieuse contribution à ce combat qui nous réunit et je remercie Jean-Pierre Tardieu et Bernard Millet de m'avoir permis de vous adresser ces quelques mots. Merci.
Bonjour à tous. Je tiens tout d'abord à remercier l'Association française pour les Nations Unies pour l'organisation de cet événement. Aujourd'hui, plus que jamais, nous le savons, nous constatons, il est urgent d'agir pour enrayer la perte de biodiversité au niveau mondial. Les rapports des scientifiques de l'IBES ou du GIEC en ont déjà apporté la démonstration et appellent à une action collective ambitieuse. Face à ce constat alarmant, la France est mobilisée pour agir pour la biodiversité et contribuer à l'adoption d'objectifs de protection ambitieux lors de la prochaine COP15 de la Convention sur la... Bonjour à tous. Je tiens tout d'abord à remercier l'Association française pour les Nations Unies pour l'organisation de cet événement. Aujourd'hui, plus que jamais, nous le savons, nous constatons, il est urgent d'agir pour enrayer la perte de biodiversité au niveau mondial. Les rapports des scientifiques de l'IBES ou du GIEC en ont déjà apporté la démonstration et appellent à une action collective ambitieuse. Face à ce constat alarmant, la France est mobilisée pour agir pour la biodiversité et contribuer à l'adoption d'objectifs de protection ambitieux lors de la prochaine COP15 de la Convention sur la diversité biologique. Nous avons accueilli en septembre dernier le Congrès mondial de la nature qui a donné une nouvelle ampleur au dialogue multilatéral sur la protection de la nature après l'organisation d'un One Planet Summit en début d'année. Ce congrès a en effet constitué un grand rendez-vous de concertation et de mobilisation de l'ensemble des acteurs, qu'ils soient scientifiques, collectivités, États, associations environnementales et acteurs économiques, après une longue pause liée à la crise sanitaire qui a marqué ainsi une étape majeure vers la COP15. L'ensemble des motions adoptées à cette occasion, ainsi que le manifeste de Marseille adressé à toute la communauté internationale, doivent désormais être mis en œuvre et permettre d'attaquer de front cette perte de biodiversité et le changement climatique. D'ici à la COP15, la France va continuer de prendre sa pleine part pour enrayer cette perte de biodiversité. Nous redoublons d'efforts aux côtés du Costa Rica pour élargir encore la coalition de la haute ambition pour la nature et les peuples, avec d'autres pays partenaires. Avec déjà plus de 80 pays engagés, cette coalition constitue une masse critique de pays en capacité de promouvoir avec force l'adoption d'un objectif de protection de 30% de terres et 30% de mers protégées dans le futur cadre sur la biodiversité. En France, cet objectif de 30% est déjà atteint sur notre territoire terrestre grâce aux efforts fournis et il le sera courant 2022 pour le territoire maritime. Au niveau national, nous nous sommes engagés plus loin, notamment en Méditerranée, qui accueille l'une des plus riches biodiversités au monde. Bien qu'elle ne représente que 1% de la surface des océans, elle abrite plus de 17 000 espèces, 1/5 de la flore mondiale. La France vise un objectif ambitieux de 5% de protection forte en Méditerranée, et ce d'ici à 2027. La France défend également la conclusion d'un traité international sur la pollution plastique. Des discussions ont lieu sur ce sujet dans le cadre de l'Assemblée des Nations Unies pour l'environnement, et en février, nous souhaitons l'adoption d'une résolution qui nous permettra d'engager les négociations. En ma qualité de vice-présidente de la PNUE 5, je porterai fortement cette ambition pour un cadre international contraignant sur les plastiques. La France souhaite s'engager plus largement pour l'agenda international sur l'océan et nous organiserons en février prochain à Brest un One Ocean Summit qui est préparé en coopération avec les Nations Unies et de nombreux partenaires. Ce One Ocean Summit sera l'occasion de rassembler autour d'initiatives concrètes et fortes les leaders et toutes celles et ceux qui veulent apporter une contribution déterminante pour faire de ce rendez-vous un sommet des solutions, des innovations et de la gouvernance partagée. La lutte contre la déforestation et la dégradation des forêts constitue un autre combat à mener collectivement si nous souhaitons préserver le poumon de notre planète, précieux réservoir de biodiversité et puits de carbone incontestable. La France est aujourd'hui pleinement engagée dans la mise en œuvre de la stratégie nationale de lutte contre la déforestation importée et à l'occasion de la présidence française du Conseil de l'Union européenne au premier semestre 2022, nous entendons bien faire avancer les discussions au niveau européen pour l'adoption d'un règlement qui permettra une action élargie en faveur du déploiement de chaînes d'approvisionnement durables. Les pays doivent montrer qu'ils n'attendent pas l'adoption d'un nouveau cadre pour prendre des mesures concrètes au niveau national qui contribueront à la mise en œuvre de nouveaux objectifs. La France prépare sa 3e stratégie nationale pour la biodiversité, la stratégie 2021-2030, à l'appui d'une large consultation des acteurs et des territoires. Cette stratégie, dont la publication est prévue début 2022, constituera la réponse de la France au futur cadre stratégique mondial pour la biodiversité post-2020. Vous l'aurez compris, il nous revient de relever aujourd'hui le défi commun de la biodiversité, celui qui doit nous permettre de vivre à nouveau en harmonie avec la nature. L'urgence d'agir impose dès à présent la mise en œuvre de solutions concrètes, ambitieuses, pour renverser les tendances que nous connaissons et éviter que de nouvelles espèces rejoignent la liste rouge de l'UICN. Nous devrons également concrétiser lors du rendez-vous de la COP15 de nouveaux objectifs mondiaux de protection de la biodiversité dans un cadre de préservation ambitieux, efficace et inclusif. Mesdames, Messieurs, je vous souhaite des échanges fructueux. J'espère que les conclusions de votre événement pourront se traduire par de nouvelles perspectives d'engagement collectif en faveur de la nature. Je vous en remercie. À très bientôt.
rapidement, je voudrais vous présenter l'organisation de cette journée que nous avons voulu évidemment centrer sur la biodiversité, mais aussi mettre en avant les relations fortes qui existent, comme cela a déjà été dit, entre les grands sujets, le climat, la biodiversité, la déforestation, la désertification, et aussi l'alimentation mondiale qu'on ne peut jamais oublier pour les presque 8 milliards d'habitants. Cette journée sera organisée autour de 4 tables rondes. Les 2 du matin seront modérées par Thomas Friang, ici présent, qui a créé et qui est le directeur général de l'Institut Open Diplomacy. Les 2 de l'après-midi par Anne Thézenas du Moncel, qui est journaliste. Les 2 tables rondes du matin seront essentiellement consacrées à la biodiversité. La première va positionner le sujet sur le plan scientifique. Quel est l'état actuel? Quel est le constat actuel? Quels sont les grands enjeux? La seconde table ronde de ce matin positionnera davantage la problématique politique. Quels sont les grands dessins, les objectifs, notamment ceux que l'on peut avoir pour la COP15 qui se réunira dans quelques mois. Les 2 tables rondes de l'après-midi élargiront le sujet. D'une part, la 3e table ronde, donc de début d'après-midi, comment dirais-je, qu'est-ce que c'est déjà oui, à la relation entre la biodiversité et ces autres grands thèmes, notamment en les reliant à la question de l'alimentation en particulier, mais à toutes les autres questions aussi. Et enfin, la dernière table ronde sera une table ronde de témoignages d'acteurs engagés de divers horizons, fondations, ONG, et aussi entreprises, grandes et petites, comme vous le verrez. Entre le matin et l'après-midi, nous aurons en début d'après-midi un keynote speech, pour parler franglais, délivré par notre interlocutrice au PNUE, Madame Sherine Zorba, qui étendra la vision à la relation entre ces sujets et les grandes questions de stabilité mondiale et de préservation des droits humains qu'évoquait Bernard Millet en préambule. Voilà l'organisation de cette journée qui se terminera donc en fin d'après-midi par la conclusion qui sera les propos conclusifs qui seront présentés par Bernard Millet et Sherine Zorba qui sera à nouveau en liaison avec nous, si la technique veut bien fonctionner pour cela. Et nous aurons l'occasion de boire un verre de l'amitié à la fin de cette réunion. Merci beaucoup. Je passe tout de suite la direction des débats à Thomas Friang. Merci.
Ça va marcher, voilà. Bonjour à tous. Merci, Monsieur le Président, cher Bernard, pour cette très très belle journée, cher Jean-Pierre, pour m'avoir fait l'amitié de me confier le soin d'animer ces débats d'introduction, de cadrage. Vous l'avez dit, 2 sujets essentiels, le constat scientifique et l'état des lieux politiques. On va commencer donc par cette première table ronde que j'introduis un peu en français, mais qui va se dérouler en anglais, puisque nos 3 orateurs sont anglophones et que c'est la langue de travail pour pouvoir maîtriser ce sujet complexe, en dépit du fait que nous sommes à la maison de l'Amérique latine et que tout ça aurait pu se passer dans une autre belle langue des Nations Unies que le français. Et donc, sans plus tarder, je voudrais juste souligner un paradoxe qui en réalité n'en est pas tant un, c'est qu'on est le 8 décembre, c'est la journée mondiale pour le climat et on parle de biodiversité. Et ça montre à quel point les sujets sont éminemment liés dans ce domaine-là. On sort de la COP26 de Glasgow et l'Association française des Nations Unies a eu l'instinct essentiel de faire la conjonction entre la COP26 climat et la COP15 biodiversité qui, comme on l'a dit, se déroule sous présidence chinoise a commencé à se dérouler sous présidence chinoise en réalité, parce que c'est un travail de longue haleine. Une première réunion a déjà eu lieu, en virtuel malheureusement, et tout le monde sait, y compris pour des raisons d'effondrement de la biodiversité, pourquoi est-ce que tout ça se passe virtuellement, et se poursuivra au printemps prochain à Kunming. Et pour en parler, pour dresser l'état des lieux scientifiques avec nous de ce sujet, puisque le titre de cette première table ronde, c'est « Quelle est l'évaluation par les scientifiques de l'état de la biodiversité des milieux naturels ?» Il va s'agir de résumer en 1h20 des travaux scientifiques d'une quantité et d'une complexité considérable. Donc on va faire preuve d'un esprit de synthèse difficile à maintenir, mais on a pour ça la chance d'avoir avec nous, je crois que ça va s'afficher, 3 orateurs de troupes premier plan que je me permets de présenter dans l'ordre alphabétique, ne sachant pas comment le protocole s'applique à d'aussi grandes éminences. Le docteur Thomas Brooks, qui est le Chief Scientist du congrès, de l'Union internationale de conservation de la nature, l'UICN, IUCN en anglais. Thomas va nous rejoindre. Madhu Rao, docteur Madhu Rao, qui est Senior Advisor du Wildlife Conservation Society, mais qui est également la présidente de la commission sur les aires protégées de l'Union internationale de conservation de la nature, l'UICN, World Commission on Protected Areas. Bonjour Thomas, bonjour Madhu, j'espère que vous m'entendez bien. Et nous avons également l'immense plaisir de recevoir Sir Robert Watson, qui a une carrière scientifique extrêmement étendue sur ces sujets en la matière, en tant que paléoclimatologue à l'origine, mais qui est là, dans ses qualités toutes particulières d'ancien président de l'IPBES, Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystems Services. Donc on va, sous l'égide du PNUE qui soutient cette initiative de l'AFNU, pour pouvoir dresser un panorama scientifique d'une façon extrêmement simple, après cette introduction déjà trop longue, prendre une série de questions pour dresser le panorama avec nos orateurs et dans la foulée, vous proposer à celles et ceux qui nous suivent en direct sur Facebook, sur YouTube, je crois qu'il y a plusieurs réseaux sociaux qui nous accompagnent et qui augmentent l'empreinte carbone de la journée, mais qui nous permettent de rester inclusifs en ces journées de pandémie, et aussi de la part du public. Au total, on pourra prendre une vingtaine de minutes de questions, donc préparez vos interrogations, on les fera tourner en français, en anglais. And I now switch into English to make sure everyone is on board, and I hope Madhu, Thomas and Robert are with us to lay out this backgrounder on the scientific issue of biodiversity. With the first question I'd like to address to Madhu, who I remind is chair of the World Commission on Protected Areas at IUCN. I'm always a bit curious on the notion, the expression itself, of the sixth mass extinction. It sounds like it's an atomic bomb, but we don't see any explosion on Earth. This expression means a lot. It reminds us to the dinosaur era. And for those who don't figure out what it means, I'd like you to let us envision how deep the issue is. Madhu, you're first.
Be here. In terms of the extinction crisis, I think the IPBES reports itself have highlighted
Madhu, I'm taking the responsibility of interrupting you for a few seconds, just the time we warm up the sound in the room so that we can hear your answer before you get back to us. And I do hope it's all right now that you can respond again.
Yeah, okay. Yes, I mean, I think it's very clear now through the best reports that species extinction rates are estimated to be 1,000 times the background rate and are expected in the future to be almost 10,000 times higher than we are. So in terms of why we don't see it, I mean, we don't see the explosion, but actually species are critically endangered in many parts of the world, like in Southeast Asia. The region has globally the highest proportion of species that are on the brink of extinction. Many of these species exist in single-digit numbers. There are very few, and they're definitely not very visible. So they're neglected both in terms of research, but also many people are not even aware that they're on the brink of extinction. Many of these are non-charismatic species. We tend to always look at the elephants and the tigers, but there are large numbers of turtles and birds that are on the brink of extinction. Over to you, Thomas.
Madhu, I'm afraid we lost you in the last sentence, so that if you could repeat your last one.
I just wanted to say that I think many of the most neglected species are on the brink of extinction because there is not enough awareness of their status of extinction. So many of the neglected species, such as turtles and birds, are on the brink of extinction. And there's very little research attention being paid to many of these species.
Yes, indeed. We got your last point, and thank you very much for helping us in managing the techniques here. Having fully hybrid event last minute because of COVID is kind of touchy. But based on what you said, and I'm just recording the numbers, which is actually dramatic. 1 million species at least has been endangered in the 6 mass extinction among 8 million identified species. It gives us the depth of the problem. I'd like to turn to Dr. Brooks. Thomas, I remind you, the audience, you're the chief scientist of IUCN. And when we talk about biodiversity, we obviously think first of the stunning images of endangered species like the white rhino, great primates that were pictured and so cared of by Jane Goodall and global figures like her. But the problem is not about those very powerful images. It's much bigger than this. And yourself, as the chief scientist at IUCN, you're working on the red list of endangered species that is getting longer and longer. I'd like you to explain to us how longer this list has been and become, and what is at stake with this list. Do we speak only about species? Biodiversity is much more than species as animals, as we know. It's about ecosystems too. So I would like you to explain to us what's the evolution of this red list.
That's great. Good day, everybody, and thank you, Thomas, for the kind words of introduction. Thanks to AFNU for convening today, and I hope that everybody is staying safe despite the continuing COVID-19 pandemic. I think maybe a starting point to my comments here is that among the long catalogue of impacts that humanity has on our planet, conversion of natural ecosystems, pollution, introduction of alien invasive species, climate change, that among that catalogue, species extinction, aside from Jurassic Park style science fiction, species extinction is the most fundamentally irreversible of this set of impacts that people have on nature. That's been recognized, of course, for many decades, recognized more than 50 years ago with the establishment by IUCN and its Species Survival Commission of the Red List of Threatened Species, as Thomas highlights. Now, as Prince Albert said in his opening comments, the measurement of the biodiversity crisis is absolutely essential to allow solutions to it. And so with that in mind, about 20 years ago now, IUCN developed a process actually led by the late Professor Georgina Mace, who I should say also served as a co-editor of the IPBES global assessment, which was approved in Paris in 2019, to establish quantitative criteria for the assessment of extinction risk. And the IUCN Red List of threatened species is based wholly on those quantitative criteria. The IUCN Red List measures the risk of species extinction. Those assessments have now been extended to encompass nearly 140,000 species around the world, and they reveal that about a quarter of species in groups where all species have been assessed face a high extinction risk. Those statistics are the basis of the extrapolation of threat to 1 million species that was used in the IPBES global assessment, and which has been highlighted already. And moreover, when those assessments of extinction risk are repeated over time, it then becomes possible to generate an indicator of changes in extinction risk. And that red list index shows us that the aggregate risk of species extinction is deteriorating. It's getting worse. Species are sliding towards extinction. That red list index is used by the world's governments under the UN General Assembly as an indicator for Sustainable Development Goal number 15. Maybe just to wrap up my opening comments, let me also make a point building from Thomas. You're noting there about the crucial fact that biodiversity is multidimensional. Biodiversity spans levels of ecological organization, including genetic dimensions, including species, and all the way up to entire ecosystems. And so over the last 10 years or so, IUCN's Commission on Ecosystem Management has established an equivalent standard for assessment of risk of ecosystem collapse. And while the Red List of Ecosystems has not yet been applied globally, it's already possible to see some really quite different patterns emerging there. For example, highlighting places like the Aral Sea as a collapsed ecosystem in Central Asia, in a region where there aren't actually very many threatened species. I think a really important message emerges from that to take to COP15 next year. On the importance of recognition that while different levels of biodiversity interact, they are different, and they occur and they're threatened in different places. And so it's really important to establish explicit goals for the safeguard of those different levels of biodiversity, species, ecosystems, genetic diversity. They underpin all of the objectives of the Convention on Biological Diversity. Brilliant. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Thomas. Indeed, we will talk about these goals in the second roundtable we have to establish the political background on the issue and the upcoming COP15 CBD. But you said and clearly laid out how complex the crisis is, because it's about ecosystems and their interactions. And I'm turning now to Sir Robert Watson, former chair of the IPBES. Bob, you've been working on this extensively, and the key issue you see here, obviously, is that living species is a complex nexus. There are many interactions between them, and that's why it's so difficult to grasp the depth and the importance of the sixth mass extinction. And I'd like you maybe to highlight the consequence it does mean for human being as we kind of see ourselves out of biodiversity, but we are part of biodiversity, and the collapse of biodiversity and ecosystems mean something to our well-being. Would you help us understanding this?
Yes, thank you very much, and a real pleasure to be here today. The first thing I would like to note is that, as has already been said, 1 million out of 8 million species are at risk of extinction. But to be honest, IPBES said that that is not necessarily a sixth mass extinction. In all the previous mass extinctions, we lost about 75 of all species. So this is a very, very serious issue, but it's a bit premature to say it's a sixth mass extinction at this moment. Now, the key question is, what are the implications of the loss of biodiversity? Well, ecosystems give us provisioning services. They provide our food, our energy, clean water, medicines. They're regulating services. They regulate our climate, air quality, water quality, pollination services, pests and diseases, and floods. And they're incredibly important from a cultural perspective. They give us a sense of place. They give us recreation. And so ecosystems are really fundamental to human well-being. Now, as already been said by Thomas, there are a series of threats to it, and he pointed them out. Land and sea use change, exploitation, especially over-exploitation of plants and animals, climate change, and then, of course, pollution, and, of course, alien invasive species. Now, up to date, it's actually largely land use and sea use change, let me rephrase it, land use change for both terrestrial and freshwater systems. In the oceans, it's largely been overfishing. Now, climate change has not been the dominant driver of ecosystem loss and loss of species in the last 50 years. But if we don't meet the Paris targets of less than 2 degrees Celsius and preferably 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2100, climate change may become the dominant driver of ecosystem degradation. And in particular, it will absolutely threaten regulating services. The problem is, unfortunately, while we understand and most ministers of finance take into account the market value of the provisioning services, the value of food through agriculture, energy, forest, fiber. Unfortunately, many countries do not take into account the economic value, the non-market value of these regulating services. So, to be quite candid, the bottom line is not only will we lose many of these services from both climate change and from biodiversity loss, there are major economic factors that are also at play here. And I think the last thing I'll say in this opening comment is we can no longer consider climate change and biodiversity as separable issues. They're interlinked issues. And now what we have to recognize is they're not simply environmental issues, they're economic issues, they're development issues, they're security issues, moral, social, and equity issues. And so we really now have to recognize that biodiversity, climate change are central to human development for current and future generations.
Thank you, Bob. We will try to make sense of this crisis in order to solve it, and we will definitely zoom about the questions of interactions between climate and biodiversity and also the economic meaning of this crisis. But before we get there, I'd like to assess also the dynamics of the issue. We've clearly said we've accelerated into this mass extinction. You clearly laid out the numbers. 75% of species already gone, 1 million among 8 keeping at risk today. The red list of IUCN extensively growing. Thomas, I'm getting back to you to understand the speed of the issue as we see increasingly numerous living hubs, ecosystems being endangered by the crisis. Are there specific zones, eras, geographies in which we need to take action first and foremost to meet the post-2020 objectives?
Great, thanks, Thomas. Yeah, sure. So I think we could say that if the first rule of biogeography, the study of life on Earth, is that life is distributed very unevenly around our planet, that the first rule of conservation science, we could say, is that conservation is also extremely uneven around the planet, both in terms of the threats that life on Earth faces. We heard details of them from Sir Watson just now, and in terms of the kind of responses that people put in place. Now, over the 1980s, 1990s, numerous scientists, numerous institutions worked on developing different approaches to identify these sorts of important places for nature, for different components of biodiversity, for birds, for butterflies, for freshwater ecosystems. In 2004, IUCN's membership of governments and civil society asked the Union to bring all of those approaches together into a single global standard for identification of key biodiversity areas, sites contributing significantly to the global persistence of biodiversity. That process took actually 12 years to complete, finally completed in 2016 as a global standard. And it's now been rolled out very widely around the world. Key biodiversity areas are identified through national processes at the level of individual countries, with about 16,000 key biodiversity areas having been identified to date around the world. Now, coverage of those important sites of key biodiversity areas by protected areas, as we heard from the Minister in her opening remarks, and by other effective area-based conservation measures is therefore an absolutely key indicator of the progress of conservation action. It's used as an indicator for both Sustainable Development Goals 14 for oceans and 15 for land and fresh water. President Bernard Millet of AFNU emphasized the key role of the Sustainable Development Goals in his opening remarks. And those indicators show that the mean coverage of important sites, the mean coverage of key biodiversity areas by protected areas is only about 40% so far. That's clearly better than nothing. That's a good start, a really important start in the safeguard of particularly important places for nature. But it shows that renewed attention to expansion of protected areas and crucially also of other effective area-based conservation measures is essential. And so maybe a key message from all of this synthesis of work for COP15 next year is the importance of explicit reference to safeguarding key biodiversity areas in the protected area related targets of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, targets number 1 and 3. Thanks very much, Thomas.
Thank you, Thomas. And as you said, biodiversity is unevenly distributed on Earth, so are the effects of climate disruptions. And I'm turning back to Sir Robert Watson. Bob, you clearly highlighted the interlinkage between the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis, which are twin sister crises, as we usually say. They are increasingly faster and faster, and I'm looking forward to your explanation as a paleoclimatologist on the effect of as a catalyst of the climate crisis on the biodiversity mass extinction. Could you explain us how it boosts this crisis?
Could you repeat the question a little bit? I wasn't quite clear on the question, sorry.
All right. I will. Thank you so much. I was curious on knowing, based on your knowledge as a climatologist, on the way that the climate crisis is accelerating the biodiversity loss. As you clearly pointed out, the sisterhood of those two crises, they are the two sides of the same coin. And we just said, Thomas said, that biodiversity is unevenly distributed on Earth, so are the effects of the climate crisis. And I'm looking forward to know how this affects, how the climate crisis boosts the other crises.
Yeah, what we have to realize is there's various issues in climate. First, what we're seeing is a significant increase in temperature, global mean surface temperature. where both the land areas and the oceans are both warming. We're seeing changes in precipitation patterns all over the world, where actually most of the wet areas are getting wetter, and that would be effectively the tropics and the mid and high latitudes, and most of the dry areas, the subtropics, are getting drier. We're also seeing major changes in extreme weather events. We're seeing more flood, heavy precipitation events, but we're also seeing longer periods of drought. And therefore, we're seeing more drought, we're seeing more heat waves. This stimulates more pest and disease outbreaks. In the oceans, we're seeing sea level rise, but equally important, we're seeing as we put more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, luckily about 30% of that is absorbed by the oceans, but unfortunately that leads to ocean acidification. Not exactly a climate effect, but linked to the effect of climate. So therefore we're seeing and we're seeing major changes in the cryosphere. Mountain glaciers are receding, the Arctic sea ice is changing, it's shrinking rapidly, and now we're seeing more and more evidence that the Greenland ice sheet and the West Antarctic ice sheet are also starting to change. So by seeing changes in temperature, precipitation, extreme events, all of these put significant threats to biodiversity. Now, Thomas is much more an expert on this issue than me, but individual species have a climatically preferred zone where they like to live. And what we're noticing is even small changes in temperature are putting at threat those species. They're losing their preferred habitat. And therefore the question is, can these species move? Can they move as climate change? Can they move with their preferred climatic range? So for a terrestrial species, or even a marine species, can they move northward in the northern hemisphere, southward in the southern hemisphere, to keep up with the change in temperature? Some species will be able to migrate, and they're at least partially adapt to climate. Other species will not be able to move at anywhere near the speed that we would like. And therefore, these species are really losing their climatic range, which leads to the threat of 1 million out of 8 million species at risk. But already what we've seen is we've already lost about 50% of warm water corals in the world. If we reach 1.5 degrees Celsius warming, and we've already seen 1.1 to 1.2 degrees Celsius, then only between 10 and 30% of warm water corals will survive. If we go to 2 degrees Celsius, all of the projections suggest we would lose 99% of warm water corals. In other words, we would almost certainly lose all warm water corals, or they would be in significant decline all over the world. So ecosystems, as Thomas has already said, are at threat. Species at threat, and it's not just temperature, it's changes in precipitation, sea level, ocean acidification, and indeed in the oceans, with a 2 to 3 degrees Celsius change, it will be a devastating effect on marine life in the tropics and subtropics. Fish will indeed move northwards, but you'll also see major changes in the assemblies of fish. So significant changes, not only in the abundances, but the species mixture.
Thank you so much, Bob, to help understanding how it does get on the ground. This crisis always seems a bit theoretical, but when we look down on the effects on our soil, on our oceans, it always seems more familiar to us. And as we have to keep a bit abstract to capture the issue itself and facilitate the rest of the day in understanding the issue, I'd like to turn back to Dr. Madhu Rao to talk about the existing frameworks, policy frameworks that are meant to deal with the different scientific issues we've just discussed. In this specific case, science and policy are very, very interdependent. It's the same IPCC in climate with the climate negotiations at COP Climate under the UN FCCC. In the realm of biodiversity protection, we hear many different acronyms. We hear COP CBD for the Convention on Biodiversity, on Biological Diversity, I'm sorry. The IUCN, the International Union for Nature Conservation. We hear about the GBF. Well, there are many, many platforms that we need to articulate to each other in understanding their role, their respective actions in dealing with this systemic crisis. And you often operate at crossroads of those different frameworks. I'd like you, if you may, explain to us how they interact, how policy and science cooperate in this realm, specifically to connect the dots between biodiversity and climate, biodiversity and health, biodiversity and land use, biodiversity and food production. Madhu, I'd like to hear you about the different interactions.
Thanks. Thank you, Thomas. Can you hear me all right?
Yep.
Yeah, I think we've heard both from Sir Watson as well as from Dr. Brooks the state of biodiversity, that biodiversity is in crisis. And I think I would like to focus a little bit on the global biodiversity framework, which is the most relevant framework at the moment for biodiversity loss. And within that framework, I think we have opportunities, and if I can focus on one of the targets, which is target 3, which looks at the need to conserve and protect at least 30% of terrestrial and marine areas if we want to reverse biodiversity loss. And I think that itself is very, very significant because there is consistent scientific agreement that very large-scale conservation is required to deal with the known drivers of biodiversity loss. And because biodiversity loss is being driven primarily by habitat loss and fragmentation and overharvesting, protected and conserved areas are key policy and practical solutions to biodiversity loss. And as governments negotiate the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, now there is strong and growing global support for effectively protecting and conserving at least 30% of the Earth's land, sea, and freshwater ecosystems by 2030 as a key requirement for halting and beginning to reverse the biodiversity loss. Not just biodiversity, but as well as contributing to addressing the climate crisis. This increased ambition of 30% signifies a near doubling of the current coverage. And you can ask why 30%? A comprehensive review of the scientific literature shows that 30% is a minimum target to protect and conserve not just key biodiversity areas, but also species at risk, high biodiversity, key migration areas, spawning areas, and ecologically intact areas which protect large-scale ecological processes. But it's important to remember that protecting and conserving at least 30% must be addressed in the context of recognizing the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities. But one key aspect of the global biodiversity framework, while we have target 3, which focuses on protected and conserved areas, or OECMs, it is useful to look at target 3 in relation to many of the other targets. Conserving areas or area-based conservation measures can be key approaches for human health and spatial planning, which can help identify which areas to protect and where to grow food. So there are various aspects of the global biodiversity framework that are all interlinked, and area-based conservation measures sort of sit at the center of those linkages. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Madhu. Actually, you anticipated another question I wanted to ask you. So if I may, before getting back to Bob and to Thomas, I'd like to deep dive a bit about this issue on protected areas. You already said there is a need to raise the ambition of the global biodiversity framework to 20 to 30% of protected areas, and that's one of the key issues of the negotiation at Kunming. But I'd like to ask you this one specific question. As we talk about the results of the Aichi framework, the 20 targets that were listed, none of them has been achieved. And you said target 3 was about protected areas already. So I'm curious on knowing if we did not achieve the Aichi framework, to what extent is the 30% higher objective achievable, and what do we need to get there, and will even be enough to actually ensure we put an end to the biodiversity mass loss we are going through now?
Yeah, thanks, Thomas. So I think the scientific evidence says that at least 30%, and if we actually include areas that are important for climate, there are some scientific studies which say that we can go up to 50%. Now, answering your question about, well, we barely achieved the Aichi targets, so how are we going to expand to 30%? Yes, I think 30% is huge ambition, but there are a number of opportunities, and one significant opportunity, if I can say, is something that we've heard before in this panel, which is related to other effective area-based conservation measures. So it's not just looking at protected area systems, and we certainly need to secure what we have. We need to improve the effectiveness of existing protected area systems. We need to focus on biodiversity outcomes. We need to make sure area-based conservation measures are achieving biodiversity outcomes, because that's the main reason. If we're going to establish protected and conserved areas to reverse biodiversity loss, we need to track biodiversity outcomes. But coming back to other effective area-based conservation measures, they represent a unique opportunity for us, because they can, through their official recognition, we can now bring into what counts towards the target, if I may, areas that are outside formally protected areas, that are governed and managed for different purposes, but which are effective in achieving biodiversity outcomes. So it opens up this entire portfolio of land use that has biodiversity importance and now can be considered as eligible to be counted towards the 30% target.
Thank you so much, Madhu, to help us understanding if those numbers are not even unrealistic, and we hear a determined optimism in your voice as an advocate for nature conservation for years now, chairing the Commission on Protected Areas at IUCN. My initial question was to you, Madhu, was about the articulation of international frameworks, but this is a question I can also ask to Thomas Brooks. Thomas, we just came out not only of COP26 Glasgow, which is actually for a climate convention put a lot on the table about biodiversity, but we also came away from Marseille and the IUCN Congress. And therefore, I'd like to ask you two questions actually at the same time. First, could you, we all are here volunteering, citizens willing to be involved in being part of the solution, as we know we are part of the problem, but we do need to understand the mapping of organizations working on this issue, UNEP, COPS, IUCN, what is the global biodiversity framework in that realm? Is it a result from one or another institution? Could you help us to kind of map and articulate those frameworks and organizations so that we can see how civil society can be part of the venture? And I was willing to have this map in mind before asking the other question that is key to get to solutions. Is we have heard it from His Highness the Prince of Monaco. We have heard it from Secretary Abba. There is no achievable target without a multi-stakeholder coalition to reach the goals. the SDGs in general, but specifically when it gets to SDG 14 and 15 about life under water and life on land. So I'd like you, having that map in mind, what kind of multi-stakeholder dynamics you see to get us to achievable results at Kunming? 2 questions for you, Tom.
Thank you, Thomas. I think that there's rather a lot in your 2 questions there. Let me have a stab at it, and then my fellow panelists will doubtless add additional points. Let's see. First of all, on the question of coherence of policy frameworks, I very much agree that the global environmental governance can appear daunting. It is complex, and it needs to be complex, because the environment is a complex factor. We have to be considering the different elements of living nature explicitly. So it is important to be agreeing on goals for, let's say, mercury over here, or climate change over there, or trade in endangered species over here. Maybe an important way forward to strengthen policy coherence there is to do so at the level of measurement, and this, I think, is very much at the heart of this panel discussion. We know that there are large reporting burdens placed on governments to track progress towards multinational environmental agreements. Looking for ways to maximize the synergies and to harness the same indicators, maybe disaggregated in different ways, to report towards different international commitments is, I think, a really important way forward here. Probably a starting point in all of this relates back to the Sustainable Development Goals. We talked earlier about the Sustainable Development Goals and their associated indicators process. The Sustainable Development Goal indicators have all undergone intergovernmental screening. They have published metadata and annually reported data sets. And so drawing from those Sustainable Development Goal indicators is the first step in reporting towards international commitments, for example, as headline indicators for the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework back to COP15 for next year. Having them draw in the first instance from the SDG indicators would be a really strong step towards policy cohesion. Maybe to look on towards your next question regarding uptake of the challenge of safeguarding life on Earth across all of society. Maybe a starting point for that, this has been mentioned already by Dr. Rao in her answer to the previous question, and the IPBES global assessment showed this indisputably. The world's governments failed to deliver the 20 actually targets of the 2011 to 2020 strategic plan for biodiversity. There were many challenges underlying that failure, but perhaps at least a major one of those, perhaps the major one, was that it was widely perceived that the actually targets, the previous biodiversity strategic plan, solely belonged to governments or solely belonged to environment ministries. It was not, the term that's being used is it was not mainstreamed across society. Institutions, actors across society could not see themselves in this plan. Now, in the IUCN World Conservation Congress in Marseille a couple of months ago, highlighted in the opening of this discussion, there was a lot of discussion around this, how to broaden the debate across society. So mechanisms like the Local Action Summit, bringing together cities and regions, subnational governments, and the Indigenous and Local Communities Summit and Youth Summit, and the CEOs Summit convened in Marseille, all picked up on this discussion of mainstreaming across society. I think that the one mechanism, and again taking us back to our core question for this panel around measurement, that is going to be really fundamental here, is the concept of science-based targets as a mechanism to support such mainstreaming. This very much emerged, actually taking us back to the earlier discussions of synergies with climate change response. This very much emerged in the context of development of the Paris Agreement, to take the 1.5 to 2 degrees goal and break it down to the level of individual actors, such that any institution, any actor is able to understand, to document, to measure what the contribution that they stand to, and indeed they must make, if we collectively as a global society, as a global community, are going to be able to meet global goals established. That same concept is now being applied actually increasingly widely for biodiversity. So for example, for biodiversity at the species level, it's supported by the establishment of a species threat abatement and restoration metric, which allows any actor to measure what their specific actions in terms of conservation actions or in terms of restoration actions in specific places have the potential to contribute towards a species goal in the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. And that metric is now available through the integrated biodiversity assessment tool to support all actors in contributing towards the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, hopefully to be agreed at COP15 in Kunming next year. Brilliant. Thanks, Thomas.
Thank you so much, Thomas, to help us understanding the articulation of all these actions. And you've clearly laid out two main ideas I would like to build upon to get to Bob before getting to the audience and asking for questions. And I'm warmly inviting all our guests to prepare their questions so that we can use the very fruitful time we have with our speakers to get into more details. You said, Thomas, first, now it's a multi-stakeholder dynamics and having a science-based target model for biodiversity that helps every corporate actors to be part of the solution is key. You referred to the CEO Summit. SBT systems was originally put in place for in the climate action, but it's now race to zero on climate issues, but also race to conservation for biodiversity. And we have this tool. It's essential, and therefore I wanted to turn to Bob, because it means that private sector can play a game-changing role in achieving protection of biodiversity. You also referred to another key issue that was few mentioned in the previous conversations, which is it's not only about conservation, it's also about restoration, repairing the loss and damages that we've caused to biodiversity. And Bob, I'm turning to you on those two items, role of corporations and getting beyond conservation, getting to restoration, because you advocate for a very deep, profound transformation of our economy and its financing, the way we invest our money to be up to the challenge of the Anthropocene, both climate and biodiversity. You advocate for an alternative economic model, and I would like to know what type of change we can hope for in the post-2020 era to get there.
Thank you. What I'd like to do is first make a comment on protected areas. It's
sure,
quite
please
clear
do.
They can play an important role. However, we have to recognise that we have to do a much better job than we're doing now. Many of the current protected areas are not well managed. And so we have to make sure that if we put a lot of stock in protected areas, they're much better managed. Secondly, we've talked about increasing the size. Absolutely correct. But given species are going to have to move, we have to design close interconnections and corridors between the various protected areas. And lastly, very few of the protected areas today have been designed to be climate resilient. That is, fauna and flora are going to move. So the species we want to protect are not going to be in the same place as they are today. So while I'm very positive about protected areas, we have to redesign the protected area system much better. Now, as we move along, what do we need to do? Well, as Thomas has said, we need all actors, governments, the private sector, individuals, the NGOs, the science community, all to play their role. But before saying exactly what the private sector needs to do, maybe I can just use a couple of seconds to say, what do we need? We need to transform our relationship with nature. We need to transform our economic system, our financial system, and our productive systems, especially energy, agriculture, and water. If we don't transform our economic systems, and what do I mean by that? We need to recognize the value of nature in all of our decisions. Governments and the private sector, the financial sector, when they make a decision, don't base it on growth of the gross domestic product. That measures economic growth, but it's unsustainable economic growth. We need to think about natural capital, and human capital. In other words, what we call inclusive wealth. To make that work, that is a role for governments, the private sector, and financial organizations. We need to eliminate perverse subsidies on fossil fuels, fishing, transportation, and mining. Again, here government need to take the lead, but it will have an impact on the financial sector and on the business sector. We need to internalize the externalities, the social damage, the environmental damage in the price of our goods. And we need to embrace a circular economy. Now, in all of those things I've just mentioned, we need all actors to play their role. I would argue the financial sector is incredibly important. They need to stop funding fossil fuel. No more funding for oil and gas exploration or for new coal mining. They need to put their money in the transition to a low carbon economy. They need to put their money into more sustainable agricultural production. These large-scale monoculture farms, they are helping to feed the world, although we still have a lot of hungry people all over the world. So we need to not only transform the economic and financial sector, but we absolutely have to transform the productive sectors, agriculture, energy, and water systems. And we can't look at them anymore as individual sectors. They all interact with each other. You can't have agriculture without energy and water. So we need to have a transformation in the way governments work. We normally have silos. We have silos in government, Department of Agriculture, Department of Energy, often water is in environment. They have to be managed together. So yes, the private sector, both the productive part of it and the financing, are absolutely crucial. I have been pleased to see that the last two meetings of the World Economic Forum have really highlighted the importance of the environment. 2 years ago, or 18 months ago, they argued that 5 greatest threats to the sustainability of business were all environmental. They also said this year 4 environmental, and the 5th was related to environment, and that is a future pandemic, basically, which is absolutely linked into things such as biodiversity loss. So yes, the private sector can look all the way along its supply chain, and it must be more sustainable, embrace a circular economy, embrace using natural capital in decision making. All of the things are really quite crucial. But I am actually, in many ways, more optimistic about some of the private sector than I am about governments. Many of these pledges have no actionable action plans behind them. They're not on a pathway to 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius. After COP26, we're on a pathway to 2.5 to 3, and maybe even higher. So we need harmonized goals, targets, and monitorable actions across the conventions. And as Thomas said, must involve all facets of the private sector from day one.
Thank you so much, Bob, for this very clear concluding message. I'm happy now to open the floor for many questions. I don't know exactly how many questions we will have from the floor, but I do see already one or two. Before we get there, I'd like to, two. So just the time we need to take the microphone so that everyone can ask questions. I'd like to highlight a few takeaways from what the three of our speakers said and thank them warmly. I do get to the conclusion that we are at the tipping point of an economic paradigm shift that brings us from a resources-consuming economy to a regenerative economy. Some call a bio-circular economy, maybe another topic for exploration when we speak at the crossroads of climate and biodiversity. Thank you so much, the three of you guys, for answering my questions. We are in advance, so we have half an hour to take questions from the audience. I've seen already one there, and two other on your sides. I suggest we take questions in a row so that we'll take the three questions and I'll distribute them. Okay, please introduce yourself to ask your question.
Thank you. Well, if you allow me, I have just a couple of questions. First,
and please, could you say your name so that
Eugene Berg, former ambassador and former representative of Total in Russia, though I have the both experience. Though my first question, well, is probably theoretical. Do we have a new approach conceptual, apart from the philosopher like Morin, Latour, to encompass all these issues, energy, water, food, and so on? And I've just read that when a species is less than 1,000 units, it disappeared within 1 century. That, I think, now out of date. The rate of extension is very much quicker. Can we measure and what we do and so on? And do we have new species appearing, for instance, like in Papua New Guinea? That's first question. Then I have something very concrete. I've participated every year on the X encounter. I remember 2 years ago, the chairman of Total said, I'm putting $100 million for reforestation. And there was Frérot, the head of Veolia, is here. And I asked, 100 million, it's nothing. You should have put 2 billion. Well, not you. And I said, we have to put a pressure on all these big firms like Bezos and so on. And that's a question, all these people, what is your reaction? We have read yesterday that 1% of the most wealthy people have 52% of the capital, 76 and so on. They have individual pledges. So my question, my request, what kind of framework we, the public opinion, the organization, can push all these people to pledge billions of dollars in a big thing to do? The money is here. I don't want to tax them. I'm not neo-socialist. But individual pledge is not enough. We have to put a collective pressure. How? I don't know. Probably a resolution, even today. Very, very diplomatically. Otherwise, we have to advance very quickly. What is your reaction on this very concrete proposal?
Thank you so much for this question. We will take the mic back. We had two questions here, first on the right and the other on the left. And please, guys, state your name before asking the question, please.
Okay. Can I talk now?
Yeah, sure. And please stand up so that the camera can see you.
Okay. Well, hello. My name is Adam. That would be A-D-H-A-M, El Sayed. I'm part of the ISG MUN group, and I have a really important yet simple question to really highlight the importance of biodiversity and to help give an argument to convince the public to get behind biodiversity. So what I'd like to ask is, can any of the three members with us today give an example where the extinction of a species directly negatively and existentially impacted humanity?
All right. That's an excellent question to figure out the importance of the topic. We had a last question on the side, or maybe two questions. Please ask them. Yeah. You will stand up, yes. State your name.
So hello, my name is Sarah Luati, so Sarah without an H. And I'm also part of the ISG MUN, and my question would be, on the opposite of my colleague, if we could have an example of a solution that had maybe the biggest success of a preservation of a species, or maybe a solution that is still going on but seems to have a good outcome. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I saw last question in the front row. Yes, please do, Nicolas. We'll have another round after that.
My name is Nicolas Blanc. I am the Director of Institutional Relations of Retrouvez. Thank you, AFNU, for organizing such an amazing event. My question is for Sir Robert Watson. You were talking about valuing the economic value of nature so as to foster and accelerate the action for both climate and biodiversity. And in the meanwhile, people are more and more talking to be in harmony with nature, perhaps like indigenous tribes and their tremendous relationship to nature. And those people don't envision nature as goods, as product, as services. They are, like us, they are part of nature. So this is a first observation. And alongside, we know that we need more and more money. Perhaps we need to value nature. Last summer, the UNEP and the World Economic Forum mentioned through a report we need to mobilize $4,700 billion by 2050 for the only action towards forest restoration and afforestation. So we need more and more money. And for sure, the private sector could be an amazing route for catching this money. But should we go beyond just valuating nature? Should we go beyond and trading nature? Is there an ethical risk to trade nature beyond carbon offsetting? Perhaps, I know that FSC is beginning pilot projects so as to finance and to trade ecosystem services. Should we go until that with all ecosystem services of forests, for example? Or should we stop before? Many thanks.
Thank you so much for your questions. I'll try to distribute them to our panelists and make sure everyone has the same amount of time to answer the questions. We first have a question of political philosophy. I would say so, sir, if you allow me. What framework can we use, and how can we get to decisive action with committing frameworks that are sometimes legally binding? I'd like maybe to hear Thomas and Sir and Bob responding to this, because it's very important to you. Tom, I wanted to ask you this question first, because you referred to the SDGs, and there is already a global compass to achieve sustainability. And Bob, you spoke about inclusive wealth, and you directly referred to the importance of stopping every fossil fuel subsidy on Earth. And Sir mentioned a €1 million commitment to reforestation. I would like to commeasure this amount with the reality of yearly fossil fuel subsidies that amount for $5,900 million every year that flow into a non-sustainable economy. So first, Thomas, about this SDG approach, global approach, and then Bob about this inclusive wealth approach and the importance to find the financial means to achieve the transition.
Thanks, Thomas, and thanks to everybody for the excellent and wide-ranging questions there. Um, I was trying to scribble down notes from the commentators as the questions were coming in. I'll have a stab at a couple of them. I'm not sure if I exactly touch on your paraphrasing there, Thomas, but I'll do what I can, and then we can pick up in the discussion. Couple of key points I wanted to make. The questions about financing that came from the former ambassador, Ambassador Berg there, I really wanted to highlight in picking up on that discussion that yes, while absolutely investment into safeguarding nature, into protection, into protected areas, as we've been discussing, into restoration, is absolutely fundamentally important. I would venture that at least equally important is influencing the financial sector to steer resources away from doing damage, to stop the bad things from happening, as well as supporting the good things happening. This aligns, I think, quite well with Sir Watson's comments about the role of the financial sector in his previous intervention. And so there's a couple of really important mechanisms emerging to support this. Things like the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosure, building from the successes of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, to support measurement and transparency around biodiversity risk from financial flows. Similarly, the system of environmental economic accounting that has been being developed through the United Nations Statistics Division is going to be a really important tool in advancing this better interaction between financing and maintenance of life on Earth. I'd like to, Thomas, if I may, I would like to say a word or two about, in response to the questions about extinctions and also about successes.
Thomas, we will address this issue, and I'm turning back to you very shortly about this so that we can cover the different questions together.
Very good. Okay.
And you spoke about actually the tools we have to make sure the cash flows into the right direction. You spoke about the TFND, TCRD. Those are policy tools we will also explore more in depth in the second roundtable. But the question of the first speaker was a general question about the way we can give a moral and political compass to all actors to achieve sustainability. That's why I was referring to SDGs or to the other phrasing that Bob used as an inclusive wealth. Bob, could you tell us about the way you envision the enforcement of such an inclusive wealth? You clearly said it's at this stage about pledging, it's voluntary commitment. We had another round of pledge at COP26 in Glasgow with states committing to stop financing exploration for fossil fuels, etc. But it's still pledging. There is no legally binding agreement to achieve this transition. How can we get and move as fast as possible to this inclusive wealth if it's only about pledge? Bob.
Well, the first thing to say is there's plenty of money move in the right direction of sustainability. We have perverse subsidies, as I said earlier, on agriculture, on fossil fuels, mining, transportation. The agricultural subsidies are somewhere around $700 billion a year. The fossil fuel subsidies, the direct subsidies are comparable, $500, $600, $700 billion a year. The indirect subsidies, estimated by IMF, International Monetary Fund, on energy is $5 trillion. That is to say, we don't internalize the cost of pollution in our goods and services. So if we could move even a small part of those subsidies into the transition to a sustainable world, there is money, basically. So I think the money's there. The question is whether governments who are really in charge of subsidies are willing to make those decisions to move the subsidies away. Now, when we come to inclusive wealth, and that actually gets to the last speaker's point, when I say we need to value nature, let me be quite clear. We need to look at all of the values of nature, the economic values, that's market value and non-market value, but we need to also look at the social values. That means to say we have to look at the instrumental values, the relational values, and the intrinsic values. So it isn't just talking about the economics. We need to recognize a full range, and it is a diverse conceptualization of values. And the speaker was absolutely correct. Different cultures look very differently at this issue of valuation. But I think if we do it in the broadest sense, where relational values and intrinsic values are also taken into account, it doesn't mean to say we're simply putting a price on biodiversity, because most indigenous and local communities, it's inconsistent with their culture. So I do believe that as long as we talk about the diverse values, the full range of values, I think we're on much safer ground. Now, you can't force people to use inclusive wealth. Governments need to take the lead. They're not going to replace GDP as a measure of economic growth with inclusive wealth, but they can complement it. In other words, we need to recognize that nature has intrinsic value. Nature is finite. And by running down your capital stock of nature, you're not getting a good estimate of whether your economy is sustainably growing. So I'd like to see a large number of countries, and the World Bank is working with a large number of countries to get decision makers, get governments to take natural capital, inclusive wealth into account. It was the whole guiding document of Path of Disruptor that he released, 6-9 months ago, basically. So we can't force people to do this, but I think more and more governments, more and more in the private sector, are realizing they've got to think of a much broader way of looking at economic growth, looking at sustainable economic growth. A big one, my last point would be the conventions are all voluntary. The Paris Agreement is legally binding. That is to say, every country has legally agreed to produce what's called a pledge or a nationally determined contribution. But the pledges themselves are voluntary. They are not legally binding. And the question you always have to ask in an international agreement is, what are the compliance mechanisms? If a country doesn't stick with something they've agreed with, a pledge to save biodiversity, the Aichi targets, or a pledge to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, what are the consequences? Do you go to war? Do you have a trade war? And so we have to think very carefully about compliance mechanisms and how you can actually sort of stimulate them to get governments and the private sector to do what's required to transition to a low carbon economy, to conserve and restore biodiversity. So value and nature, in my opinion, in the broadest sense, is definitely one something, and then reducing down the subsidies and using that money in a much more sustainable manner.
Yeah, and in mentioning the danger of conflicts around these issues when there is no compliance mechanism, you squared your point with the introduction of Bernard Millet stating that tomorrow the Security Council will look at one of the first resolutions about climate and security issues, which is indeed an increasing concern from a political military point of view. Unlike, not to get too much into geopolitics and bring us more closer to biodiversity with the questions that Adam and Sarah asked together, I would bind them into one single question that I would like to address to Madhu and to Thomas. about those good examples of one success of conservation that has been achieved that can give us hope. That was the question of Sarah. And one example of a disappeared species or animal or plant that actually had a strong impact on well-being. I'm asking you this double question to the two of you, Madhu and Thomas, if you could let us know with your experience of conservation. Maybe Madhu first and then Thomas.
Thanks, Thomas. So I think in terms of, I can start with an example of a recovery of species. I can start with an example of a critically endangered species of turtle, which is called Vatiga trivittata. In Southeast Asia, as I said, a region of very, very high concentration of critically endangered species. Conservation action through captive breeding support has actually succeeded in preventing the extinction of the species, has reintroduced the species into the wild in Myanmar, and it's a really good story of back from the brink. So, and there are many other examples there. So there are very many positive examples of successful species recovery, and I'm sure Dr. Brooks will have many. But in terms of a concrete example of impacts on the well-being of species extinction, I don't have any, and I'm going to say why, because I think it depends, again, on how you define well-being. And I want to go back to the intrinsic value of this. I think, and the different values of species not extinct. We could have generations in the future who will never know what a tiger is except in what they see in pictures. But I think there's a huge immeasurable loss on human well-being just because there is a constituency of people who value tigers for their culture, for inspiration, for art. So I don't know if that's a way of not answering the question with a specific example, but I feel it depends on how you define impact.
And maybe Madhu, if I rephrase the question to, because we in France, as we read the news when the pandemic occurred, we often heard that the roots of the pandemic in Wuhan was the fact that pangolins had a degrading habitats, and then when people ate pangolins, they actually got a zoonotic disease that was not meant to affect human beings, and then it has spread into an epidemic and then a pandemic. Is this a real example of zoonotic disease? There has been a lot of debate about the relationship between that event in Wuhan food market and the global situation in which we are. Is this a type of example of impact of human well-being, or is it a misleading example? Yeah, please, Madhu, that was for you to keep deep diving.
In terms of zoonotic diseases, I think there's a lot of evidence to show that the frequency of zoonotic spillovers has been increasing over the last several years. And I think in this case, I don't think it's a very relevant comparison, I think. So, the pangolin in this case it hasn't been proven that it could be a carrier of the virus or an intermediary host. But the zoonotic, the pandemic itself has been linked to the destruction of nature and the increasing interface between humans and wildlife. So it's not an impact of extinction, per se, but it's an impact of a degradation of nature.
Thank you so much for this response. It helps us in shedding clarity on the good and bad examples we hear in the news when it comes to such context. Thomas, I wanted to turn back to you with the same question. A good example of a recovery of species, and maybe one example, whether in animal or vegetal realm, on the impact that biodiversity loss can have on our daily lives as humans.
Sure thing. Thank you. So let me start with the second of those questions, the question from Adam Al-Sayad first, about the negative impacts of species extinctions on humanity. I very much agree with Dr. Rao's responses there, but I wanted to highlight a specific example here, the case of the passenger pigeon, which 200 years ago was the numerically most abundant bird on the entire planet, the commonest bird in the world. Over the subsequent century, it was driven to extinction. It was driven to extinction by unsustainable harvest. We've had some mention about unsustainable use. It was driven to extinction by spread of disease, and it was driven to extinction actually fundamentally by conversion of natural ecosystems and loss of the forests on which it depended. That extinction had massive ecological consequences across the eastern USA, eastern Canada, but also massive cultural consequences. The question asked about the impacts on cultures as well. Many indigenous peoples, First Nations in the eastern North America, had deeply entrenched relationships, embedded relationships with the not just passenger pigeon itself, but the entire of the ecosystem of which it was a part. Maybe a final point in responding to this question is to remember that while extinction is fundamental, it's irreversible, it is the end of a continuum. Think about it as I think the phrase would be death by 1,000 cuts across that whole range of different impacts that have been described already. And that entire continuum, all of those different cuts, have negative impacts onto human well-being, negative impacts onto the benefits that nature provides to humanity across the range of types of benefits that have been described already. Moving on to a happier side of the picture. The question from Sarah Oati about examples of successes and solutions. There are very many of these. I don't want to give the impression there's a single silver bullet. The world is diverse, nature is diverse, humanity is diverse, different things work in different places. But actually just last year, there was a really important study to look across conservation action over the last 30 years since the establishment of the Convention on Biological Diversity, very much the framing to this panel with COP15 coming up next year, and to ask what would have been the impact in terms of species extinctions across birds and mammals, groups for which we know well, if conservation actions had not taken place. And that study revealed that in the absence of conservation actions which have been mobilized around the world in the context of the CBD over the last 30 years, the number of species extinctions that have taken place has been reduced by 3 to 4 times, reduced by 75%, thanks to the impacts of conservation. And those examples come from all over the world. Situations like Kowalski's horse in Mongolia and China, Javan rhinoceros in Indonesia, pink pigeon in Mauritius, California condor in the United States, a whole diversity of species which have been saved from the brink of extinction and safeguarded thanks to conservation actions. So many examples of successes. It is possible, but it needs scaling up. Back to the earlier questions on investment and finance. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. I remind our friends online that there is the possibility to ask questions with the chat. It's all feasible. There was this last question that Nicolas asked about the ethical question of offsetting carbon with nature-based solutions. Is it acceptable? Dr. Sir Watson already brought part of the answer, but I'd like to turn to Madhu and Thomas in that order to wrap up the conversation in asking you the same question. Do you see a contradiction between using our economic institutions as they are now, which actually ground, for example, the Kyoto Protocol, which caps and trades carbons to make sure we achieve carbon neutrality? Do you see a contradiction with our economic institutions as they are on the global stage as for today, with the objectives we need to achieve? And do you think we need to expect a change in those institutions before we achieve? Do you think we have the time to expect such a change? Or do you think that we can keep running with those institutions to achieve the different goals we have for sustainability? Of course, this question could be applicable to many of the SDGs. I would like you to focus your answer on biodiversity. First, Madhu, and then Thomas.
Thanks, Thomas. So I think, what is really relevant, and it reinforces what Dr. Watson already spoke about, which is the economics of biodiversity. Professor Partha Dasgupta last year developed the Dasgupta Review, where he talked about the transformative change that's needed, that we need to start looking at ourselves, looking at nature as being embedded in the economy, or the economy being embedded in nature and not outside of it. So I think that's the essential approach. And I find it really useful to look at the way he's developed the framework. And he talks about three major approaches. The first, he says, we need to balance the impact equation and increase nature's supply. So we're taking more than there is. So we need to, through protected areas, through improving efficiency of extraction from nature and produce less waste, by improving access to community-based family planning and things like that. We've got to sort of balance the impact equation. The second approach he talks about is changing our measures of economic success, which I think, again, touches on many of the things we discussed. How do we measure success? And the third, which links to the question itself, is the need to transform our institutions and systems. And within this, I think one of the suggestions he gives is the need for us to empower citizens to make informed choices and implement change. And I think there is a huge opportunity for us to sort of increase awareness amongst civil society, to demand for a better environment. I think all of us were very heartened on October 8th, the UN Human Rights Council adopted a resolution which recognized that the right to a clean, healthy, sustainable environment is a human right. So I think we've got all these things that are aligning, but I think it's really important for us to sort of step back and really transform our approach in terms of how we view nature. And this is for all of society transformation. Thank you.
Thank you, Madhu. I'd like to turn to Thomas for the last answer.
Thanks. Not an enormous amount to add to what Dr. Rao and Sir Watson have emphasised. I very much agree that the importance of consideration of all values in working through these complex decisions. Yes, absolutely, including anthropocentric values, utilitarian and economic ones, but also fundamentally cultural and ethical ones, and also absolutely intrinsic values as well. And we've seen things actually just this week, the landmark decision from the government of Ecuador to safeguard a protected area mining concessions based on the value of nature, based on the rights of nature itself. I very much agree on the importance of transformative change across the economy, but also by extension across society and thence across the natural environment as well. And I do think that maybe bringing things back around to the opening questions about the Sustainable Development Goal framework, I do think that the SDGs do provide a really valuable structure to look at these questions within. Maybe two particular characteristics, just to wrap up, that I'd highlight that I think the SDGs bring to this, that are really novel. They are the first time that the world has ever had these dimensions. The first of them is their universality. The SDGs apply across all of the world's countries. They apply to the entire humanity, the entire of our planet, the planetary enterprise. And the second of them is that they bring, for the first time in history, they bring consideration and concern about environmental sustainability to the same level as concern for economic and social sustainability. So I do think that the frameworks, the structures within which we can address these questions appropriately are emerging here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, both of you. I'd like to attempt a wrapping up of what you just said in saying that this paradigm shift that Sir Robert Watson called a inclusive world as outlined is based on three main principles. Human humility. Nature is much more complex than we can understand as we stand. It has been stated many times, ecosystem services are very, very complex. It's tough to study, to understand, to collect data, to understand the interactions between them. And it's even tougher to replicate human-centric economic solutions to copy-paste nature and make sure we keep it as it serves us, which clearly outlines the invaluable economic capital that nature means to us, which we can't process as a human based capital. Second principle, we first and foremost need to do our job. Within the institutions we already have the different international conventions we've settled, which are more or less legally binding, more or less pledging different stakeholders. We already have targets, goals, and we are always behind the goals. And let's start doing the job we have already set at the agenda before trying to transform the institution. And third, if there could be a paradigm shift, it would mean getting to a offsetting approach, economic approach, to a regenerative approach, which is essentially what Dr. Rao said, giving back to nature more than we take away from nature every day. And this is also economically very powerful as we need to invent new business models in this Anthropocene era. I would wrap up the conversation, which was meant to lay a scientific background for the day. It has been much more than a hard scientific background, also very much of social science into the discussion, which lays a good ground to the next panel we will open at 11:15, which is about the political expectations we can have ahead of coming COP and the future steps we have in the post-Aichi discussions and negotiations. I would like to stop there, very thankfully the audience which took our panelists to more in-depth discussion. Thank Dr. Thomas Brooks, Chief Scientist at IUCN, for his very insightful comments on this key question. Dr. Madhu Rao, Chair of the World Commission on Protected Areas at IUCN and Senior Advisor of Wildlife Conservation Society, for very, very detailed answers about nature protection. And of course, Sir Robert Watson's former chair of IPBES, for his inspiring words in projecting us into a more sustainable economy and society. Thank you warmly very much to all three of you, and thank you to AFNU for bringing us together virtually, in English, in a French framework. Thank you very much, and thank you, Jean-Pierre Tardieu, for having pulled together those speakers. We will meet us again in a quarter to address the next question about the political expectations we can have for the COP15. Kan-Ming, thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.
jamais où sur les limites de la francophonie en terre onusienne.
On est réaliste, je crois.
Trois interventions liminaires.
Oui, voilà. Donc, la logique, c'était l'anglais pour la table ronde, ça va. Progressivement, parce que cette table glisse.
Quand j'étais à New York, mon conseil de sécurité, je faisais moitié français, moitié anglais. Systématique.
Alors vous avez cette liberté, vous n'étiez pas tenu. Mais la France, vous venez pas vous titiller sur le thème.
J'ai jamais eu la moindre observation et ça m'a tout de suite permis de ne pas paraître le français arrogant. Et en même temps,
Quelles activités vous avez? Bon, première question.
Oui, c'est ça. Et en fait, il faudrait que je regarde là-bas.
Merci. Alors, mon micro va bientôt marcher. Est-ce qu'il ne fonctionne pas encore? Voilà. Il faut allumer le micro. Ça, c'est vraiment évident. Voilà. Ok. C'est bon. On va un tout petit peu régler le son pour limiter les échos. Voilà, ça devrait marcher. Rebonjour à tous pour cette journée toute particulière de l'Association française des Nations Unies consacrée à la biodiversité, organisée sous l'égide du PNUE que Bernard Millet a ouvert tout à l'heure, que je remercie encore très chaleureusement de m'avoir associé à ces travaux pour modérer cette seconde table ronde dédiée aux enjeux et conclusions attendues de la COP15 Biodiversité qui se tient à Kunming. Alors je dis qu'il se tient, c'est un peu tirer la réalité dans le mauvais sens, puisque la COP15 a commencé ses travaux il y a maintenant un petit moment. Elle a eu une première séquence de travail en ligne en octobre et elle se réunira physiquement, Covid permitted, comme on dit maintenant dans le jargon, en avril à Kunming, sous présidence chinoise. On va donc essayer d'explorer les possibles de cette convention, cette conférence des parties de la Convention des Nations Unies sur la diversité biologique. Je mentionne cet élément, le nom complet de la COP15, pour pouvoir faciliter la compréhension de tous nos auditeurs qui sont souvent des explorateurs du système onusien, afin que tout le monde s'y retrouve. Et je me permettais une tout petit travail de pédagogie avant de rentrer dans les détails, puisque ce matin on a lancé une quantité fulgurante d'acronymes. Il est important peut-être de pouvoir y retrouver ces petits. C'est au sommet de Rio en 1992 que les 3 conventions des Nations Unies sur le climat, sur la biodiversité, sur la désertification ont été adoptées. Ces 3 conventions des Nations Unies, dont la Convention sur la diversité biologique, la CBD, chacune de ces conventions est dotée d'une conférence des parties, une COP. Parfois, certaines d'entre elles sont associées à d'autres rendez-vous, des MOP. Et en l'occurrence, la COP 15 de Kunming sera associée à la MOP du protocole de Carthagène et du protocole de Nagoya. L'objectif, c'est de repasser en revue le fameux Global Biodiversity Framework, GBF, dont on a parlé ce matin déjà, qui fixait une vingtaine d'objectifs dits objectifs d'Aichi sur la période 2011-2020, puisque la COP 10 de Tokyo, la COP Biodiversité numéro 10, avait permis de fixer ce Global Biodiversity Framework. L'objectif donc de la COP 15 de Kunming, sous présidence chinoise et plus japonaise, est de renouveler ce cadre. C'est pour ça qu'on parle du cadre post-2020, du cadre post-Aichi. Pour s'y prendre, les négociateurs s'appuient sur plusieurs autres organisations. L'UICN, dont nous avons beaucoup parlé ce matin, l'Union internationale de conservation de la nature, qui est une organisation multipartite qui ne comprend pas que des États, mais aussi des ONG, des collectivités locales, des entreprises, des centres de recherche, pour pouvoir fixer des normes plus précises qui permettent d'atteindre les objectifs de protection et de restauration de la nature. Et il y a évidemment l'incontournable IPBES, plateforme intergouvernementale sur la protection des écosystèmes et de la biodiversité, qui est donc l'instance scientifique qui passe en revue l'intégralité des publications dans le domaine de la protection de la biodiversité, de la même manière que le GIEC le fait pour le climat. Voilà autant d'acronymes qui sont essentiels pour pouvoir comprendre le paysage politique dans lequel nous allons nous plonger. Petit exercice pédagogique clé avant de rentrer dans les détails, puisque on est tout proche du 30e anniversaire du Sommet de la Terre de Rio. Ça sera en mars l'année prochaine. Et c'est au 20e anniversaire du Sommet de la Terre de Rio, donc Rio plus 20, en 2012, que les premiers travaux sur les objectifs de développement durable ont été amorcés, ODD qui ont été adoptés en 2015 sous l'égide de Ban Ki-moon, et qui comportent deux objectifs totalement dédiés à la biodiversité. L'ODD numéro 14 pour les océans, les mers et la vie aquatique, et l'ODD numéro 15 pour tous les écosystèmes terrestres. Voilà, pardon pour cette petite pérégritation onusienne essentielle pour que tout le monde y retrouve et s'y repère dans la conversation que nous allons avoir en profondeur, puisque nous avons la chance, et je les présente en français avant de lancer cette conversation en anglais, d'avoir à nos côtés trois éminents orateurs qui vont pouvoir nous aider à nous plonger dans la COP 15 biodiversité. Après avoir reçu tout à l'heure Sir Watson, Dr Brooks et Dr Rao, nous avons ce matin, dans un ordre non protocolaire et tout alphabétique, pardonnez-moi, parce que là, je ne sais pas faire la hiérarchie ontologique des protocoles internationaux, c'est pas mon truc. Autant vous faire une cartographie des instances onusiennes, ça j'arrive. Mais à ma droite, Madame Sylvie Lemay, qui est ambassadrice française pour l'environnement, qui est elle-même une ancienne du PNUE. Vous avez dirigé le secteur industrie, technologie, économie. Vous avez été au ministère de la Transition écologique comme directrice des affaires internationales. Et vous venez de quitter Bercy. Vous étiez la secrétaire générale adjointe chargée du plan de relance, dont on sait l'importance qu'il joue pour l'accélération de la transition écologique en France, avec plus de 30% des moyens qui sont dédiés à l'accélération de la transition écologique. Merci, Madame l'ambassadrice, d'être avec nous, chère Sylvie. Nous avons également à distance Ma Jun, qui est le directeur de l'Institut des politiques et des affaires environnementales de Pékin, qui est basé donc en Chine et qui s'adresse à nous à distance. Jun est un ancien journaliste. Il a notamment été lauréat du prix Ramon Magsaysay en 2009 et du prix Goldman pour l'environnement en 2012. Et l'institut qu'il dirige étudie, collecte de très près les données environnementales qui permettent d'accélérer la participation des acteurs de la société civile et notamment des entreprises à la transition écologique et au traitement des grands défis environnementaux, notamment celui de la biodiversité. Et last but not least, Madame Elisabeth Maruma Emrema, qui s'exprime, elle, depuis la côte Est des États-Unis en ses qualités de secrétaire exécutive de la Convention sur la diversité biologique, mandat qu'elle exerce depuis 2019, après avoir été directrice juridique du PNUE et secrétaire exécutive de plusieurs conventions internationales sur l'environnement, celle qui est dédiée aux espèces migratoires qui appartiennent à la faune sauvage, celle sur la conservation des petits cétacés de la mer Baltique, du nord-est de l'Atlantique et des mers d'Irlande du Nord, et de l'accord sur les gorilles, 3 accords qui sont également suivis, dont le secrétariat est exécuté par le PNUE après avoir exercé un début de carrière au ministère des Affaires étrangères de Tanzanie. Merci à vous 3 d'être parmi nous. J'excuse en son nom et avec l'accord de l'AFNU l'absence de Michel Rivasi qui n'a pas pu se joindre à nous du fait de difficultés d'ordre personnel, mais nous allons pouvoir entrer dans cette conversation que je vais maintenant poursuivre en anglais. Vous avez toujours la possibilité de poser des questions, d'utiliser vos casques pour la traduction si vous le souhaitez, et à partir de 12h15, on prendra des questions pour pouvoir continuer la conversation. The first question I wanted to ask to launch this conversation was meant to Mrs. Maruma Emrema, Madam Executive Secretary. If I may ask you this question, the COP15 CBD is meant to put an end to the review of the strategic plan for biodiversity, the global biodiversity framework that I exposed earlier, 2011-2020 targets, and to suggest to develop to outline a post-2020 global governance framework for biodiversity protection, the supposed and very expected post-Aichi targets. None of the Aichi targets was actually met as we stand now. So there is an urgent action for a very, very demanding issue that takes time. This has been clearly laid out and said this morning repeatedly. It needs consistent and constant action, but also rapid implementation. And this calls for good ownership of the framework for all stakeholders, firms, local governments, national governments, etc. So I'm asking, what are the key issues of the upcoming COP to ensure that there is an increased ownership of the next post-Aichi targets that we can expect?
Thank you very much.
We can hear you. You can go ahead.
Thank you very much, and thank you for this invitation. Delighted to see my former colleague, Sylvie Lement. Great to see you, despite the fact we are meeting virtually. Indeed, unfortunately, the 20 Aichi biodiversity targets, none of them were fully met, although some progress was made in several areas. And there are reasons why that happened. Building on those reasons, and if I can go just into quickly few of them, why Aichi targets were met, and we need to avoid the same mistakes, so to speak, not to repeat as we move to further development of the new post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework and its implementation. Reasons behind being, one, the implementation began 3-4 years after its adoption, because many countries took a step back to begin developing national biodiversity strategies and action plans, a national consultative process which took a while. And basically, much as we are talking of the Aichi biodiversity targets, where for 10 years, a decade, in practical terms, was less than 10 years. So that is one. Two, not all stakeholders were fully engaged in its development, and the result also in the implementation. There was that expectation that implementation was dependent on governments alone, while now we know governments alone cannot solve issues related to biodiversity loss. We need all of society, all of government approach with the engagement of indigenous peoples, local communities who are mostly affected as the result of loss of biodiversity. We need the youth, we need the business, we need the financial sector, we need the women. So all stakeholders need to be engaged. And that was a major lesson we learned from the Aichi biodiversity target. Moving to the development of post-2020, what the two co-chairs responsible for the framework have done during this, particularly this extended period, is the result of the pandemic and the postponement of our conferences of the parties, had been to engage all different stakeholders virtually to discuss and contribute elements to the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. And if one reviews the current draft, which was launched in July, one could clearly see that all stakeholders literally can see themselves in the framework, and we hope by that recognition is them also engaged in the implementation of the framework when it is adopted. Different studies have clearly indicated when the impact on loss of biodiversity. The IPBS you have mentioned that underlying primary drivers of biodiversity loss being land and sea use change, exploitation, pollution, changes in climate, overexploitation of natural resources, invasive alien species, in addition to other secondary drivers like infrastructure development, population growth, rule of law, governance, and the like. So these have been the causes of the loss. But also we have been told by recent studies how 50% of the global biodiversity is dependent moderately or highest on biodiversity and ecosystem services it provides. OECD have told us $125 to $140 trillion per year accrued as the result of nature services, which is 1.5% the size of the global GDP. So clearly there are benefits, and the globe is dependent on the biodiversity and the ecosystem services it provides. We also know that we have big population dependent, their livelihood is dependent on biodiversity. And particularly this is where the indigenous peoples and local communities come in, and clearly then they also have a role to play in reversing biodiversity loss. Businesses, financial institutions are dependent on nature, and that's why now, as part of the development of the global biodiversity framework, we are engaging the financial institutions in terms of assessing the risks and the impacts of their activities on biodiversity, to be able then not only to look at the dependencies, but also opportunities accruing, the 50%, for the $4 trillion coming from or accruing from biodiversity. And therefore being able also to disclose not just the risks and the impacts, but the dependencies, and contribute in future also to the implementation of the framework when it is adopted. So in short, that's what I can say. Lessons learned, build on them, avoid them as we look to the post-2020 framework when it is adopted. Hope to begin implementation immediately and not to take 3-4 years as we did during the last decade. And delighted that the Global Environmental Facility, together with UNEP and UNDP, have come up already to commit to fast track and support particularly developing countries with quick beginning of implementation as soon as the framework is adopted.
Thank you so much for this very complete and detailed answer on the political process that the COP is following to prep. You've been clearly highlighting the carrots. We also need to speak about the stick as we go into a very, very, very demanding effort for all the international community. I'm then turning to Ambassador Sylvie Lemay to speak about the way we can achieve these goals and targets. Target 3 was about protected era in the pre-Aichi framework, the so-called Global Biodiversity Framework. France is, with Costa Rica and with more than 80 countries, heading the high ambition coalition to advocate for a wider ambition on protected eras, up to 30%. how can we make sure we can achieve this in Kunming, and is it enough, 30%? This morning, some said that if we relate the biodiversity and the climate crisis, 30 would be already very ambitious. It's much higher than what we achieved, 17% as we go, but we would need a 50% objective. How ambitious is this, and how can you, with the French and Costa Rican leadership, make sure we get there at Kunming?
Thank you very much, and I'm also very pleased to see Elisabeth, former colleague, on board, and I'm sure with her leadership we will succeed in Kunming. So that's the kind of my first reason for optimism. The second issue is the question you raised regarding one specific target. I mean, so far, as Elisabeth mentioned, there is a framework that is on the table, which is just a text written by the two co-chairs of what we call the open-ended working group, which is the specific group that is composed of all the different countries and that come on board to specifically negotiate this particular framework for the next 10 years.
And the two co-chairs come from Canada and Uganda,
and
right?
Uganda, yes, exactly. And so they have put together a text, having listened to all the stakeholders, as Elisabeth mentioned. And among the different items that are in the text, there are some targets, and there are actually 21. Who knows how many will be in Kunming in the end. And the third target is indeed about one specific issue that is very dear to France and Costa Rica and other countries, which is to protect a certain amount of area, which is 30%. This data is not coming out of nowhere. It is indeed the best science at this time. Some people are arguing indeed, and we are aware of that, that it should be more. But the common consensus so far is that 30% would be good. And if you recall, in IUCN in Marseille, there was a discussion and decision adopted that mentioned indeed those 30% of protected area, and they asked for scientists to look further into the 50%. So 50% might well be, in the end, a good data, but this is not the one that is currently prevailing. So that's the first thing. Then why 30%? Indeed, I mean, I'm not going into the science. You have had this point this morning, but it's more what and to do what. And so I think there is a relation between the fact that we are trying to gain more countries agree to that, and also understanding what it means. Because we're not talking about having 30% frozen areas where we could not even enter. That would not make much sense. I think we would quickly realize that. But it's also, there are various degrees of protection. And one, of course, is the kind of réserve intégrale, as we say in French, very highly protected areas, I would say. And some other are much less. And in addition to the to the very protected areas, there are also areas that are, for instance, surrounding parks, and that would need other measures to help protect, including the important areas. So all this is, in a way, I'm going into that to say that to achieve 30%, we need to, first of all, rally, but also make sure people understand what it would mean for them concretely tomorrow, with them, with the local communities, with the indigenous people. And so what we have done is indeed launch this coalition and made sure, including with during the pandemic, to get a maximum number of countries. We have currently, I don't remember if it's 77 or 80, but around 80 countries that are on board so far. We have had India joining the coalition very recently, and we're quite, we are congratulating them for having joined the coalition. And the goal is to get 100 countries during the One Ocean Summit in Brest, end of February. So set up a goal is always a good way to mobilize people. And in doing that and having these countries, what we are doing right now is conducting workshops and groups that are talking about all these different issues in terms of what it means, how do we do it. So we would like to make sure that indeed those countries that have, in a way, gone that way are also ready to move ahead and understand how they can be supported.
It's interesting to hear how diplomatic language has changed in first setting the goals and then saying, well, we will find out solutions on how we can achieve the goals. There is another idea that is in the air about eras. We just spoke about protection eras, but there are increasing discussion on restoration eras. As we know, we already have a major footprint on nature. Is it part of the discussion of the High Ambition Coalition to maybe set goals around restoration eras? Or is it something you discuss?
It's not part of the 30% of protection is different from the 20% restoration. And just to respond to your point, which is that we set up an objective and we discuss how to get there. I think it's one of the points that was critical for the Aichi target. It's easy to set up target. It's not easy to know exactly how to get there. So the first thing, and I think it is one thing that all countries, and specifically Europe, is going to be adamant about that, is that we have a monitoring framework. We, at the same time as we adopt the goals, we also adopt a framework and the financial facilities that go together. Otherwise, we're talking, we will be accused of doing blah blah, and that would be right. So I think we need to do all together. So that's part of the answer. The second point regarding the 20% restoration. Yes, indeed, there is a need to restore lands, and that's a kind of separate target. Some of the land that would be restored would be going back to, for instance, agriculture or other activities, and some would be going into protected areas. So, of course, there is a linkage between the two, but the two are separate, and they need to be addressed separately.
It's very interesting to see that we've moved from a conservation issue to a broader approach that encompasses also restoration issues as we awareness has risen about the existing impact on it. I'd like to turn to Ma Jun, which I remind our audience. Ma Jun is the director for the Institute of Public and Environmental Affairs in Beijing, tracking environmental data to facilitate participation in tackling environmental challenges. Jun, you're not talking on behalf of the Chinese government as you are leading an independent organization, though you're speaking from China and you have probably much more insights than we do in the way that the Chinese government presides over the COP15 that is expected in Kunming in April. It sustains its efforts with different working groups. Sylvie already referred to the first working group that is co-chaired by Canada and Uganda to set the post-2020 framework. And China has a specific leadership in pulling together financial leadership on the table. It has already announced it would create a fund with 2 million euros to support biodiversity protection. But we also hear emerging pledges from Chinese businesses around the Chinese presidency on the way that the private sector can be involved in addressing biodiversity issue. As you track commitments from the Chinese sector, etc., how would you assess this hope that we can have that the first economic superpower makes something bolder with not only its government but also its private sector?
Thank you, Thomas. A warm welcome, a warm greeting from China, and hope we can all meet in person next April and May in Kunming. While the conservationists like us all hope that this is CBD post-2020 framework can be crafted in Kunming, it is necessary, as you pointed out, that the lessons of COP10, held in Aichi, and none of the targets have been really achieved. And one reason behind that is the funding. The lack of consolidation of all the funding commitment, and the gap is really big. So this time, the Chinese government has put forward this 1.5 billion RMB, or about 2.3 million, 230 million US dollars, and this is larger than previous host countries over the past several quite a few COP meetings, and of course, as the host country, China hope to invite others also to join, because we all understand the gap. The real gap is much larger than this amount. So we hope that China hope that the successful operating of this fund could attract more state and non-state actors to join the efforts. But to attract more to join this, I think we first, in our view, we need to build trust, and with that, we need to build a data infrastructure, and this is going to give trust and confidence to attract more stakeholders to contribute. I think on the climate action side, we already see COP26. All countries agree that MRV, measure, reporting, and verification system need to be built. And I think on the biodiversity investment side, there's also need for that. And I do fully believe that information technologies could serve as a game changer. As you pointed out, we can meet and talk remotely. It's a magic. Yes, this is the vast development of IT technologies, and we try to harness that as an organization in China. By working with partners, we are now trying to depict all China's ecological zones, or the red line zones, on the digital map, on our global map database, our website, and apps. Just as Minister Limit mentioned, that all countries are trying to designate, and in China, 25% of the territories have been nuded to these red line zones, and among them, nearly 20% to the ecological protected zones. But where are they, and what kind of species they're protecting, and what kind of status? So we try to depict this and develop this digital map side by side with the information on local air and water quality data. Every day we compile 500,000 records, monitoring data on that. And also we're trying to overlap that with the 7 million factories operating in China. We have the geolocation of them, so as to help all the major financial institutions in China to understand their footprint. Ever since the last year, since the outbreak of the pandemic, more financial institutions tap into our environmental data for due diligence, because they can hardly be on the ground to assess the environmental risk. So far, we have helped them to run through 200,000 of corporations who want to borrow money from some of the largest banks, including the state-owned banks. So I do trust that the next step is to first to build the database, and then build on that, try to make it more regional, or even hopefully more global, so to track and assess the performance of all the projects and companies, factories, and also in the meantime to develop global standards and criteria, so as to enable the financial institutions and other investors to join the efforts to make contribution. Thank you.
Thank you, Jun. So that gives us an idea of the momentum that the Chinese non-governmental actors also can do to boost and accelerate movement towards calming. That helps us to also envision and capture maybe the expected outcomes we can have out of COP15. And therefore, I'd like to turn back to Elizabeth to understand what's your own expectation on this as the executive secretary of the Convention of the UN on biodiversity. We've clearly laid out the emergency, we've clearly laid out the need for ownership. You've expressed the lessons we could take away from the Aichi framework, and the way it was maybe not economic enough for rapid implementation in less than 10-year time schedule. What's the expectation for the next framework? What's the post-2020 ideal result of Kunming conference?
Thank you very much. In terms of expected outcomes or conclusion, one is to have the framework itself, negotiations being finalized and have it adopted. Adoption is one. I mean, we have heard from world leaders that they want to see a transformative and ambitious post-2020 global biodiversity framework. So that is one. But we also need to ensure that that framework, when it is adopted, it moves from being a document to actual practical application, implementation on the ground. And to be able to have it implemented, we will expect first to see efforts for the conservation and restoration of biodiversity, those efforts being scaled up at all levels. And of course, that will equally depend on the local context of each country. We'll want to see effective steps taken to address all the remaining pressures driving the biodiversity loss. Remember, I had mentioned land and sea use, alien invasive species, pollution, unsustainable exploitation of biodiversity, particularly in marine and inland waters. We'll hope to see a complete shift in the production of goods and services, especially food, how food is produced, is transported, is marketed. And to do that, then we'll hope to see adoption of sustainable agricultural methods that are able to meet the growing global demand or the growing population, of course, while imposing fewer negative impacts on the environment and reducing the pressure to convert more land to production. Mr. Ma has underlined, and yourself, that adequate financial resources to implement the framework will be key. And currently, the draft framework is looking at being able to close the financial gap by at least $700 billion per year by 2030. $200 billion per year for implementation. But more so, we need to see the $500 trillion spent yearly on harmful subsidies to be able then to turn these incentives from harmful, which are harmful to biodiversity, be redirected, repurposed, reformed into positive or nature positive activities, from harmful to green biodiversity. We need to ensure that that framework will really ensure equitable and effective participation of all stakeholders, particularly not forgetting the indigenous peoples and local communities, and to respect their rights over land in a just manner. So all these efforts, hopefully taken together and really with that high ambition, will not succeed to bend the curve for biodiversity loss unless they are tackled together in a whole of society, whole of government approach moving forward. That all stakeholders are involved and not to be left alone to the government. So implementation is for all, and the framework will be universal, actions on the ground to make it effective and make the changes, transformative changes needed within the next decade.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. As you pointed out, there is a need for acceleration, I would say. So, Sylvie, you said we want to avoid another blah, blah, blah summit that is the usual now punchline from criticism about diplomatic action in the realm of environmental. But when we look at the facts, Aichi framework was adopted in 2011 or 2010, well, almost a decade already. The UN SDGs were clearly laid out 6 years ago with a 15 and 14 goal about biodiversity, so already emergencies for the last 6 years. We have now been in a 2-year pandemic that has roots in biodiversity degradation. What's needed to get faster? And I'm asking this not in general, but to the French ambassador, who puts a lot of effort in boosting, catalyzing the dynamics. We've already spoken about the high coalition ambition. President Macron and your team works a lot on other side actions to accelerate ambition. We have heard about the One Planet Summit earlier this year that was dedicated to biodiversity with deliverables expected, like the Great Green Wall. Where do we stand on this concrete project that was expected for years? You just referred to the One Ocean Summit expected in January 2022, early ahead of the COP15 in Kunming. What's the purpose of these other summits? Is it other blah 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 style stuff, or is it other boosters to launch the pad higher in the sky?
Well, it's a long question, and I'm going to try to respond. And the answer is not just one point. You don't get from a situation that is, in a way, as you rightly said, and Elizabeth and the other speakers all converge in the same way. It was not applied, and the situation is degrading. So how do you reverse such thing? It's not just going to be Kunming. And I agree with Elizabeth as well. It has to be the entire society and the entire world that takes this issue into account. And we have to be honest and acknowledge the fact that it's much more difficult in a way to make biodiversity tangible for people than perhaps it is for climate. On climate change, we have spent years to try to convince the political leaders of the gravity of the situation. And we have a measurement, in a way, which is the ton of carbon, which is easier, to talk about climate. We have one measurement. On biodiversity, it's much more spread over. We are talking about the number of species, and there are animals, there are plants, and there are We are talking about water, we are talking about many different issues, and we don't have, and it's not feasible at this stage, and of course there is a lot of research, but we don't have the equivalent of 2 degrees, in a way, Paris Agreement. That has been, in my view, one of the most difficult things, is how do you convey that there is an emergency. It's easy for people to realize that you have less birds and all that. How do you convey what we are aiming for in a very simple way is much more difficult. So the first thing, and I think it's part of also this kind of gathering, is to understand what we are talking about and therefore what is needed. And it's the drivers that have really to be tackled. The drivers are starting to be well known. I mean, it's really the land use change, because we are indeed having cities that are going to grow, and we have agriculture that is indeed increasing, for instance, deforestation. So that we are starting to realize. Now, how do you reverse that is much more complex. It's also not going to happen from one day to the next. So the text incoming that we are all hoping to get, in my view, to make sure that it is implemented, it will have to be specific enough in terms of what we are aiming at. And I wish we have as many data as possible, and also indicators that are that we are going to use to measure what we are doing. Otherwise, it's going to be a little blurred, and that is not what we are aiming for. The second thing is that, as I said, it has to address not just the government to do something, but it has also to do as much as possible to make sure that the value chains all over the world, the companies, take biodiversity into account. The greatest thing that we could achieve is that everyone realizes that for biodiversity now is the same as it has been for climate in COP21. Yes, everyone has to mainstream biodiversity in their business at the private sector level and government level, and everyone has to do their own part.
Yeah, we've touched upon that point this morning with SBTs for businesses, and we will deep dive into that. But before, I know you have a commitment very soon, and before we have to leave you without us. I wanted to ask you specifically, because you spoke about the general process and being multi-stakeholder, having a holistic approach, those very, very meaningful principles we have seen emerging in embedding more actors to deliver on the promises and achieve faster the targets. But there are also very concrete projects that you're working on. You said it's difficult to figure out the topic of biodiversity. We don't have a plus 1.5 degrees Celsius objective for the topic of biodiversity. But when we speak about the One Ocean Summit, for example, everyone knows what the ocean is, so we can already project ourselves in action. So what's the purpose of such events? What's the type of outcome we can have that can feed global dynamics with the COP, with other concrete actions, just like the One Planet Summit delivered on the Great Green Wall project in its sub-Saharan regions?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, I was mentioning all that to mention the fact that everyone has to conduct those projects. And the success of Kunming is indeed going to be in the delivery of Kunming. And the delivery will have to be embedded in the text itself, meaning that there is a need for sufficient ambition in terms of financial means and in terms of monitoring framework. In terms of project that, I mean, you're alluding to two things. First of all, let me perhaps take the One Ocean Summit. The One Ocean Summit is indeed targeted at one part of the biodiversity, which is ocean, on which indeed we know some of the things that need to be done. And the summit aims, as all of the One Planet Summit that President Macron has convened, to do a few things, which is to get additional commitments from stakeholders to do something concrete. One of the things that, for instance, can be done for ocean is to take care of plastic. as we all know, you know. And we know that there will be a discussion in another area, which is the UN, United Nations Environment Assembly, where countries are going to discuss whether they would like, and I hope they will, to start a negotiation on plastic, to get rid of plastic or to manage plastic. This will have to be the outcome of the negotiation. The One Ocean Summit aims to try to rally more countries around this objective. That's one. It's one step after another. And I think it's always like this in negotiation. As I said, you don't go from A to Z in one go. So that's one thing. The second thing we know that is important for ocean is to have areas where fish in a way can reproduce, where you protect them. So marine protected areas are one issue that is going to be important, and we are aiming at identifying additional protected area in the ocean and announce them, hopefully, in the world. There are many other things, including additional research that need to be done. I mean, science goes together with actual delivery and project on the ground. So that's for the examples from the Ocean Summit. And of course, the main thing is to make sure to mobilize the leaders of this world so that they are aware of what needs to be done in ocean and make sure that it is indeed afterwards in the Kunming text. And that we, by understanding more what it is about and what can be done and having more countries rally to that, then the negotiation should be facilitated. So these kind of events are not blah, blah. I think they are real steps toward an outcome, which I hope is going to materialize afterwards in Kunming.
Thank you so much. I know you have a commitment at, you need to leave us at 12:15. So maybe if I use the last 2 minutes we have with you, the latest, I would say, event that happened in such spirit was precisely One Planet Summit in January, which was precisely meant to address biodiversity issue, with the announcements of financing for the Great Green Wall, for a afforestation project in the sub-Saharan region. 50 coalitions were launched during this event. Do we have some news from the Great Green Wall? I know you're not the ambassador from the wall itself, but maybe you've heard about it?
Of course, yes. And yes, indeed, this is typical of something that you announce and then you make sure you follow up. So there has been in IUCN in Marseille a first event to follow up on what commitments could be have been made. And we have already $19 billion that have been committed from different donors to this particular project, which is a huge project indeed. That is covering several countries in Africa. The second thing is that there has been, after that, there has been also a workshop, I think in Montpellier, early October, where the current implementation and the monitoring framework has been discussed, including, I mean, I know it has pointed to the need for specific monitoring tools, the inclusion of local communities and other things. I mean, I'm not going to go into the details. What I am understanding right now is that at this stage, we have 48% of the $19 billion that are already engaged. And I'm not saying it's being disbursed, because it takes time to disburse a project, specifically if it is to do with agriculture or forestry. But indeed, it is being, I would say, dans le tuyau, in the pipe. In the pipe, thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Lemay. I know we have to leave you now, so I'll keep running the panel without you, and we will take questions after the panel is run. Thank you so much, Ambassador Lemay.
Thank you.
You actually spoke about deforestation. We just spoke about afforestation with the Great Green Wall. Deforestation is key. It feeds the acceleration of climate change. It also tackles on the biodiversity issue, as forests do represent 80% of terrestrial biodiversity. China is also very committed on that front, discussing the EU strategy on imported deforestation that Secretary Abba just referred to this morning, that should land during the French presidency of the EU. June, I wanted to turn back to you and ask you what type of commitments you expect from the Chinese government chairing the COP in dealing with deforestation, as China is at the roots of many trade routes on the globe. It can roll out enhanced environmental standards along all supply chains. What do you see emerging from China here?
Thank you, Thomas. And as a country, China has suffered very, very badly from the deforestation in our history. You know, we are one of the old civilizations, and during all this centuries, you know, a lot of deforestation have occurred, and which led to soil erosion and some of the very severe flooding disasters. So after the torrential flooding in 1998, Chinese government issued a logging ban, and then decided to return the hillside farming to forest. This has, over the past 20 years, we have seen gradually forests are gradually coming back, and our forest coverage, the rate is going up, and just more recently, you know, in the meeting concluded in Glasgow in COP26, China joined more than 100 other countries to commit to stop deforestation by 2030. So within the country, so much resources have been committed to that, and I think the government and the society have confidence that China will be able to deliver its commitment within China. But as you said, now this is increasingly become a more global issue, as deforestation is having its impact globally, and also as the whole trade and investment and manufacturing have gone global, the consumption have gone global. So China is the second largest economy in the world, with a rising affluent population society. Our consumption, our demand is going up, and in the meantime, China is still the factory of the world. So the whole industrial process, the manufacturing, the processing of raw materials, all this demand, you know, we have, you know, in China, it means that China has sourced in a very, very large volume of timber and other forest-related products overseas. So China knows its global responsibility, and now the matter is how to you know, how to check this, because this is going beyond China, and we lack the experience in dealing with all this overseas impact and operation. You know, how to manage the footprint, how to reduce the footprint and manage the whole operation. It's a challenge. But within China, I think there are some good lessons to be learned. You know, China used to suffer, you know, the past 40 years suffered very badly from air and water pollution. And eventually, with the sufficient monitoring, all this monitoring and transparency, and build on that, build people's awareness and enable, tap into the data infrastructure to build the infrastructure to help enable the stakeholders to join the efforts. So far, our database have compiled more than 2 million records of violations from all these main suppliers, which are part of the global supply chain. We're happy to see over the past 10 years, increasingly, the major brands, global brands, have tapped into the data, comparing their list of suppliers with our list of violators, and motivate them first to ensure compliance, and then go beyond compliance by measuring and using the accounting platform to measure and to report and to set target for emission reduction. And during the process, now some 20,000 suppliers have made improvement of their practice. So I hope to see that globally, on the forest side, there's also a chance. I know we have the Global Forest Watch, but can we just also clarify, build a data platform that can connect all these dots between the what's going on in those countries rich in tropical forest and other forest, and then all the way to the manufacturers, and then to the brands who source from them, and to the consumers. We hope that there will be opportunities to build the link, and there's all these digital solutions, the fintech, all these new technologies that we can tap into. I trust there are very good potential on that. Thank you.
Thank you, June. It's indeed very important to understand how the Chinese economic hub role will play its part to address deforestation issue, as, for example, the EU is now adopting and extending the responsibility of importation on deforestation with its commercial partners, so its trade partners. So it's an increasingly geopolitical topic. There is another topic that was kind of geopolitical over the past few months, which is the link between health and biodiversity, and it's very symbolic that the Chinese government chairs the COP15 CBD as the COVID-19 pandemic has occurred, and the outbreak happened in Wuhan. It actually accelerated the importance given by the UN system to the link between human biodiversity and human health and nature health, with this emerging WHO initiative called One Health. Do you think that there will be further actions taken in that realm at Kunming? Do you expect other steps specifically on this issue of One Health approach?
Yes, I think this One Health approach is extremely important. I think this ongoing pandemic have taught everyone a very hard lesson that that if we continue to neglect the health of the planet and of all the species, then we cannot ensure our own safety, health and safety, and well-being. And when something like this, when a pandemic really started, it's very hard to really bring the genie back into the bottle. Those who always try to brush aside the risks, say they want to blindly keep optimistic. I hope that we all learn a very hard lesson, and I'm happy to see that in China and in the world there's so much sober consideration and thinking on this issue. And this is very important because now we are in the process of COP15, and we just convened the COP26 on climate as well. So much commitment have been made, but they're on paper. They're on paper. It's so important, as Mr. Lemaitre mentioned, that we need to, if we don't want it to be blah, 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 then, we have to implement them. So this is a more complex context, global pandemic, climate change, and tension between development and conservation is even more pronounced at this moment. So without sufficient attention, so first and foremost, I trust that government and society must recognize that humanity and nature as one community of life share one future on the earth. I think this is the theme of COP15. Then we must probably value products and services provided by the biodiversity and the planet's ecosystem. I think we shouldn't neglect nature's vital role in climate mitigation, resilience, and adaptation. And the healthy forest, wetland, coastal, and agricultural grassland ecosystem have served as enormous carbon sinks and provided 1/3 of climate mitigation solutions. So we need to coordinate the two. I think this is also very, very important to conservationists to keep in mind. And as I said, we see hopeful signs. We see globally there are model countries like Costa Rica, well known for this pioneering scheme to restore natural system. And as the host country, China has also upheld what's called so-called eco-civilization. This is based on the thinking between the relations between man and nature. So we upheld eco-civilization as one of the fundamental social economic development principles. As mentioned, designated 25% of the land territory to red line zones, and issued the logging ban, and started establishing natural parks, water pollution control, and just issued a 10-year fishing ban on in the Yangtze River Basin. I think over the next 10 years, we hope to see biodiversity information and best conservation practices pooled to better coordinate the protection of nature with pollution control and climate actions, and help mobilize public supervision. I think to mainstream this globally and to tap into the strengthen the government regulation. And then, as Elizabeth mentioned, it's not just the role the government, but the multi-stakeholder approach, which is extremely important. And with that, we need data information to bring all this together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jun. And as you've outlined, One Health approach is not another blah blah thing. It's a very concrete initiative with new pandemic observation and readiness center that has been set up by the German government. It's a global coalition to study more in-depth ecosystems degradation and the increasing risk of zoonotic consequences and pandemics. It's another full entire topic we could cover with AFNU and on global health. As you pointed out, it's not only about the relationship between nature health and human health, it's also about the whole impact of our environment degradation on our human being health with pollution, etc. So it's another full range topic, but keeping in track with addressing the blah 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 criticism, I'd like to turn my last question to Elizabeth in asking about the next steps after Kunming, because as you clearly stated in your introductory remarks, it's not about having adopted another platform. It's about starting as soon as the platform is adopted to implement it. So what's the next step? What's going to be the follow-up mechanism? What's the monitoring principles of the post-2020 agenda? Do you already have a plan to identify rapidly gaps between targets agreed in Kunming and reality action? Do we expect another 4 or 5 years time lapse between target setting and corrective action? What's going to happen after Kunming?
Thank you very much. Oh my God, I hope we will not waste more time. That's a major lesson learned from the last decade. But what will happen after Kunming, which is already happening? First, the framework will be adopted together with a robust monitoring framework and reporting mechanism that will help the parties to be able to monitor progress of implementation and successes, and enable the parties also to be able to identify gaps and solutions, hopefully as simple, and will focus then on national realities and ownership. We'll also expect the countries to actually now develop their own national targets aligned to the global targets, agreed global targets and indicators. One lesson we learned from the Aichi was that where progress had been made, or a lot of progress had actually been made at national level with national level targets. The problem was a number of the countries, the national targets were not aligned to the global targets. And when we did the assessment through our global biodiversity outlook, we looked at how we fared on the global targets. But actually at national level, a lot had happened. So again, national targets to align with the global targets. The framework will also be accompanied with a capacity building action plan, because building the capacity of the countries to ensure that the countries have the right tools and knowledge base necessary for the implementation of the framework at national level will be key. Then, of course, we have already talked of the need to scale up resources for biodiversity from all sources. And we need to work with the financial sector to also align financial flows to responsible investments. And as I said later, to be able to manage the risks, the impacts, the dependencies across their portfolio and business models, which are not harmful for biodiversity, to increase opportunities for positive outcomes on the ground, including restoration. We need to engage all stakeholders that I mentioned earlier. We need the business sector to ensure that critical transformation in production and consumption systems are taking place in a sustainable manner, including, for instance, through green value chain, reimagining business models, making tools and mechanisms available to support the transition, both from of large, medium, small-scale enterprises everywhere. Key also is we need to embed or mainstream biodiversity into decision-making process, both for public and private, and ensuring biodiversity values are fully integrated into policies, regulations, planning, and development process. More important is to ensure equitable sharing of the benefits arising from biodiversity and ensure the effective participation of the indigenous peoples and local communities, equally looking at the role of women, youth, and other stakeholders in the implementation process. The framework is supposed to be for all, universal. It is about time that we put at the heart of implementation plans all those whose livelihoods are dependent on biodiversity and our future generations. So action on the ground, involving all stakeholders, all of government, all of society, one health approach, as you have mentioned, mainstreaming actions on the ground, increasing resources from all sources, and repurposing harmful subsidies. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. We will now take questions from the audience if there are some. I guess we can take, we have a little quarter left, so if we want to take questions, I don't see any fingers showing up. Do we have questions on the chat? I don't know whether we can see this or not. Maybe the technical team can help. If not, I do have one. And actually, it's for Elizabeth, if I may, because the way you described getting beyond Kunming, it sounded to me very likely to getting beyond Paris when we were approaching the COP21. We had the COP21 for climate was meant to set a universal framework with ability of any stakeholder and leading, of course, countries and states to pledge with nationally determined contribution, with a review mechanism and a monitoring mechanism to assess the effectiveness of those nationally determined plans, with the objective that was universally agreed of maximum plus 1.5 degrees Celsius of global warming. And here we are 6 years later. We barely had the plans at Glasgow before Glasgow, and when we review the plan, we more or less look like the world will be around plus 3 degrees, which is way beyond the goal. And the monitoring mechanism and the review mechanism was adopted right at Glasgow, so 6 years after Paris. So as the mechanics sound the same, which were actually perfectly sound, how do you expect a greater success in this new framework for global governance of biodiversity that it has happened in the climate realm? What lessons can we take away from the Paris Climate Agreement, if there is a?
You have mentioned the monitoring mechanism under the climate developed in Glasgow, in Glasgow 6 years after. We have learned from that, and this time the framework will be currently, in addition to the development and negotiations of the framework, is also ongoing negotiations on the monitoring accountability framework, so that the framework, when it is adopted, it will be adopted with this monitoring, reporting, review mechanism to enable now the countries to assess how they will be doing through implementation. So we hope that we have also already, not sure if it will be complete by Kunming, is also the development of the indicators for each and every target going on. So these are processes taking place together, hopefully to be adopted with the framework itself. Just the way I mentioned, action plan on capacity building, there will be action plan on gender role implementation, monitoring, accountability framework, they will all be as a package. Important also, we need to bear in mind that the framework is aligned also with the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And if one looks at the SDGs or the goals, much as many people look at goal 14 and 15 for biodiversity, in actual fact, biodiversity contributes to 14 sustainable development goals out of 17. So clearly, if the goals of the framework will not be met, it means that will equally put in jeopardy the 17 or the 14 sustainable development goals. Again, when we look at global ambition, it's not only to look at biodiversity in isolation from climate or Paris implementation, and what we have seen in Glasgow for the first time in the COP, that nature biodiversity was an issue of debate on the table than ever before. And clearly we came out with that understanding of the links and connection between changes in climate and loss of biodiversity. And I think one of the speakers earlier, either Mr. Ma or Sylvia had mentioned, or yourself, 1/3 of climate mitigation and adaptation will come from nature or biodiversity. Climate is looking at nature-based solutions for climate, and therefore we cannot solve changes in climate without looking at loss of biodiversity. These two issues are inseparable. So
Thank you.
as we move forward, we need to look at all in an integrated manner.
Thank you so much for wrapping up this conversation in referring to the SDGs themselves. As you can see on my jacket, I always think it's useful to refer to this global framework, because not only because it's very relevant to talk about biodiversity, as you pointed out, 14 of the goals will be partially achieved through the biodiversity action, but also because it's another way of talking about those topics very concretely, very easily, so that everyone, corporation, big firms or local SMEs, can be part of the solution, just like local governments. It is an increasingly well-known referential that everyone can take on its own. And to square this conversation, as I've not seen any other questions from the ground, there is indeed a way to continue the spirit of the UN Charter that Bernard Millet referred to in his introduction, which is that it's now about sustainability and beyond the fundamental rights that were at the heart of this UN creation. Actually, when saying so, I had a question from the floor. Jean-Pierre Tardieu had a question. If we can give him a mic, that would be helpful.
Pour gagner du temps, je vais poser ma question en français. Beaucoup d'orateurs ont souligné ce matin l'importance de l'opinion publique pour soutenir tout ce qui est à faire dans tous ces domaines. Et à cet égard, les COP jouent un rôle, je crois, important en matière de sensibilisation, de pédagogie, si j'ose dire, par rapport à l'importance des sujets. Et je crois que c'est particulièrement important dans ce domaine de la biodiversité, qui a été un peu moins sous les feux des projecteurs que celui du climat. Donc je voulais demander à Elisabeth, qu'est-ce qui était prévu? Est-ce qu'il y aura, comme à la COP de Glasgow, ou comme nous l'avions eu à Paris en 2015, une large possibilité de faire intervenir un grand nombre de représentants des sociétés civiles, des collectivités territoriales, etc., pour participer à ce travail de pédagogie?
C'est très important. Merci d'avoir posé la question en français, puisque nous avons la chance d'avoir avec nous aussi l'artisan de la COP 21 qui a fait en sorte que la société civile soit présente en la personne de Pierre-Henri Guignard. Je pense que la question que vous avez adressée concerne directement Elisabeth, qui pilote plutôt le processus juridique, mais elle concerne aussi la société civile chinoise et l'État chinois qui accueille. Donc en fait, je propose qu'on pose la question à nos deux orateurs. Peut-être June en premier. What is Beijing planning, Kunming planning to welcome all stakeholders to be part of the dynamic, and how does the UN takes this multi-stakeholders approach into account in delivering the post-2020 target? First question for June and the other for Elisabeth, and that's going to be the conclusion of the day, of the morning.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question, and I really hope that we can all welcome all of you, all the conservationists to Kunming, and now the process is, I think the plan is to have it in Kunming, but in person. But we all know that the pandemic has yet to be brought under control, and with that, there's still a real question mark there. And I fully agree with the
Jean-Pierre.
Yeah, Monsieur Pierre, in his point that we shouldn't allow biodiversity COP to be overshadowed by the climate COP. Unfortunately, it was like that. It was the case, and I think with that, I truly hope that more attention could be paid on that to the COP15 process, and we are going to make more efforts within China to bring more limelight and to bring more attention to the COP process, and this is a golden opportunity to enhance people's awareness on this issue, which people is less familiar with. So much biodiversity has been lost on this, within Chinese name. We're talking about all kind of progress, some sort of progress made in terms of the increase of population of, for example, panda or antelope and tiger. But in the meantime, we're seeing the freshwater biodiversity still declining in a very, very serious way. So much needs to be done within China. So we need to raise awareness. But in the meantime, I do hope that all the other countries and the stakeholders in other parts of the world also pay more attention to the Kunming process, and to make sure that we don't lose this opportunity to create a very robust and effective post-2020 framework for the next 10 years, and hopefully by even for the time period by 2050. Thank you.
Thank you, Jun. And the same question applies to Elizabeth, who has a different role in prepping the COP as the executive secretary of the convention. She's more facilitating the negotiations from the UN standpoint. So how do we at the UN involve civil society in making sure we collectively contribute to raise awareness on the issue of biodiversity?
Generally, in our processes under the Convention on Biological Diversity, civil societies are being involved. They are the stakeholders invited in all our meetings. They do contribute in the meetings, even in the negotiation, with one caveat, in the sense that when a stakeholder or when the civil society makes a recommendation, then that recommendation needs at least one party to second it, then it goes into the documentation. And I think that's a progressive. It doesn't talk of 10 parties, just one to second any recommendation from the civil society or any stakeholder. It goes through the documentation. So they are involved. They have been involved in this development process with the co-chairs through their own different processes to get their contribution to feed into the framework. And I presume that, of course, will continue and will continue to also see their presence in Kunming during the COP itself.
Thank you so much.
Really looking forward to continue working and strengthen the role of the civil society.
I'm sure this event in its own contributes in involving civil society in understanding biodiversity issues and in being part of the journey to Kunming, as the Association Française des Nations Unies has a broad audience. I'll switch back into French to wrap up the conversation. Merci beaucoup, Elisabeth.
Emrema, et merci beaucoup June, merci Madame l'ambassadrice Sylvie Lemay d'avoir pris le temps, alors que les négociations sont denses et complexes, de partager avec nous vos réflexions, vos espoirs, vos attentes par rapport à ce processus politique d'une très très grande complexité d'organisation à cause de la pandémie, complexité aussi du fait de l'importance d'associer une grande diversité d'acteurs aux travaux. Vous avez parlé, COP, ça veut dire les États partis, mais vous avez expliqué que chaque acteur de la société civile n'avait besoin de convaincre qu'un seul État pour faire partie des négociations en déposant des amendements au brouillon qui est préparé par le groupe de coprésidents ougando-canadiens. Et donc ça permet d'inviter toutes celles et ceux qui se sentent pousser des ailes de négociateurs onusiens dans la salle, et il y a beaucoup de jeunes qui sont là et qui nous écoutent, qui pourront peut-être apporter leur pierre à l'édifice, puisque comme vous l'avez dit Elisabeth, c'est un sujet qui se travaille avec toutes les parties prenantes, et vous avez prononcé à de nombreuses reprises le mot « jeune ». Ce sujet étant déterminant pour les générations futures, c'est donc une double bonne raison d'inviter cette audience toute particulière à s'emparer du sujet grâce à l'AFNU, que je remercie très sincèrement d'avoir organisé cet événement. Merci à nos panélistes. Le programme continue dans cette journée très riche, accueillie par la Maison de l'Amérique latine, puisque les débats reprennent à 14h30 avec une allocution de Shirin Zorba, qui est directrice du secrétariat du forum du PNUE Sciences et Politique, et qui donnera ensuite lieu à 2 autres tables rondes tout aussi passionnantes pour pouvoir rentrer dans les détails plus pratiques de comment est-ce qu'on peut protéger la biodiversité, la déforestation, la protection des océans, les milieux terrestres, maritimes, etc., avec de nombreux témoignages d'acteurs pour pouvoir se projeter dans du concret, loin du blabla. Merci à tous d'avoir été si nombreux parmi nous ce matin, d'avoir bravé les masques et les tests PCR pour participer à ce débat, et à tout à l'heure, 14h30 pour la suite, sur la chaîne YouTube de l'AFNU ou à la Maison de l'Amérique latine.